Chapter 9. In the city, no one knew that one half of the Cossacks had gone in pursuit of the Tatars. From the tower of the town hall, the sentinel only perceived that a part of the wagons had been dragged into the forest, but it was thought that the Cossacks were preparing an ambush, a view taken by the French engineer also. Meanwhile, the Koshevoy's words proved not unfounded, for a scarcity of provisions arose in the city. According to a custom of past centuries, the army did not separate as much as was necessary. They tried to make a sortie, but half of those who did so were instantly killed by the Cossacks, and the other half driven back into the city with no results. But the Jews availed themselves of the opportunity to find out everything, whither and why the Zaporozhtzi had departed, and with what leaders, and which particular kurens, and their number, and how many had remained on the spot, and what they intended to do. In short, within a few minutes all was known in the city. The besieged took courage and prepared to offer battle. Tarass had already divined it from the noise and movement in the city, and hastened about, making his arrangements, forming his men, and giving orders and instructions. He ranged the kurens in 3 camps, surrounding them with the wagons as bulwarks, a formation in which the Zaporozhtzi were invincible, ordered 2 kurens into ambush, and drove sharp stakes, broken guns, and fragments of spears into a part of the plain, with a view to forcing the enemy's cavalry upon it if an opportunity should present itself. When all was done which was necessary, he made a speech to the Cossacks, not for the purpose of encouraging and freshening up their spirits. He knew their souls were strong without that, but simply because he wished to tell them all he had upon his heart. I want to tell you, brother gentles, what our brotherhood is. You have heard from your fathers and grandfathers in what honor our land has always been held by all. We made ourselves known to the Greeks, and we took gold from Constantinople, and our cities were luxurious, and we had, too, our temples and our princes, the princes of the Russian people, our own princes, not Catholic unbelievers. But the Mussulmans took all vanished, and we remained defenseless. Yea, like a widow after the death of a powerful husband. Defenseless was our land as well as ourselves. Such was the time, comrades, when we joined hands in a brotherhood. That is what our fellowship consists in. There is no more sacred brotherhood. The father loves his children, the mother loves her children, the children love their father and mother. But this is not like that, brothers. The wild beast also loves its young. But a man can be related only by similarity of mind and not of blood. There have been brotherhoods in other lands, but never any such brotherhoods as on our Russian soil. It has happened to many of you to be in foreign lands. You look, there are people there also, God's creatures too, and you talk with them as with the men of your own country. But when it comes to saying a hearty word, you will see. No, they are sensible people, but not the same kind of people, and yet not the same. No, brothers, to love as the Russian soul loves is to love not with the mind or anything else, but with all that God has given, all that is within you. Ah, said Tarass, and waved his hand, and wiped his grey head, and twitched his moustache, and then went on. No, no one else can love in that way. I know that baseness has now made its way into our land. Men care only to have their ricks of grain and hay, and their droves of horses, and that their mead may be safe in their cellars. They adopt, the devil only knows what Mussulman customs. They speak scornfully with their tongues. They care not to speak their real thoughts with their own countrymen. They sell their own things to their own comrades, like soulless creatures in the marketplace. The favor of a foreign king, and not even a king, but the poor favor of a Polish magnate who beats them on the mouth with his yellow shoe, is dearer to them than all brotherhood. But the very meanest of these vile men, whoever he may be, given over though he be to vileness and slavishness, even he, brothers, has some grains of Russian feeling, and they will assert themselves some day. And then the wretched man will beat his breast with his hands, and will tear his hair, cursing his vile life loudly, and ready to expiate his disgraceful deeds with torture. Let them know what brotherhood means on Russian soil. And if it has come to the point that a man must die for his brotherhood, it is not fit that any of them should die so. No, none of them. It is not a fit thing for their mouse-like natures." Thus spoke the hetman, and after he had finished his speech, he still continued to shake his head, which had grown grey in Cossack service. All who stood there were deeply affected by his speech, which went to their very hearts. The oldest in the ranks stood motionless, their grey heads drooping. Tears trickled quietly from their aged eyes. They wiped them slowly away with their sleeves, and then all, as if with one consent, waved their hands in the air at the same moment and shook their experienced heads. For it was evident that old Tarass recalled to them many of the best-known and finest traits of the heart in a man who has become wise through suffering, toil, daring, and every earthly misfortune, or, though unknown to them, of many things felt by young, pure spirits, to the eternal joy of the parents who bore them. But the army of the enemy was already marching out of the city, sounding drums and trumpets, and the nobles, with their arms akimbo, were riding forth too, surrounded by innumerable servants. The stout colonel gave his orders, and they began to advance briskly on the Cossack camps, pointing their matchlocks threateningly. Their eyes flashed, and they were brilliant with brass armor. As soon as the Cossacks saw that they had come within gunshot, their matchlocks thundered all together, and they continued to fire without cessation. The detonations resounded through the distant fields and meadows, merging into one continuous roar. The whole plain was shrouded in smoke, but the Zaporozhtzi continued to fire without drawing breath, the rear ranks doing nothing but loading the guns and handing them to those in front, thus creating amazement among the enemy, who could not understand how the Cossacks fired without reloading. Amid the dense smoke which enveloped both armies, it could not be seen how first one and then another dropped, but the Liaks felt that the balls flew thickly and that the affair was growing hot, and when they retreated to escape from the smoke and see how matters stood, many were missing from their ranks, but only 2 or 3 out of 100 were killed on the Cossack side. Still, the Cossacks went on firing off their matchlocks without a moment's intermission. Even the foreign engineers were amazed at tactics heretofore unknown to them, and said then and there, in the presence of all, "These Zaporozhtzi are brave fellows. That is the way men in other lands ought to fight." And they advised that the cannons should at once be turned on the camps. Heavily roared the iron cannons with their wide throats. The earth hummed and trembled far and wide, and the smoke lay twice as heavy over the plain. They smelt the reek of the powder among the squares and streets in the most distant as well as the nearest quarters of the city. But those who laid the cannons pointed them too high, and the shot, describing too wide a curve, flew over the heads of the camps and buried themselves deep in the earth at a distance, tearing the ground and throwing the black soil high in the air. At the sight of such lack of skill, the French engineer tore his hair and undertook to lay the cannons himself, heeding not the Cossack bullets which showered round him. Tarass saw from afar that destruction menaced the whole Nezamaikovsky and Steblikivsky kurens, and gave a ringing shout, "Get away from the wagons instantly, and mount your horses." But the Cossacks would not have succeeded in effecting both these movements if Ostap had not dashed into the middle of the foe and wrenched the linstocks from 6 cannoneers. But he could not wrench them from the other 4, for the Liaks drove him back. Meanwhile, the foreign captain had taken the lunt in his own hand to fire the largest cannon, such a cannon as none of the Cossacks had ever beheld before. It looked horrible with its wide mouth, and 1,000 deaths poured forth from it. And as it thundered, the 3 others followed, shaking in fourfold earthquake the dully responsive earth. Much woe did they cause, for more than one Cossack wailed the aged mother, beating with bony hands her feeble breast. More than one widow was left in Glukov, Nemirov, Chernigov, and other cities. The loving woman will hasten forth every day to the bazaar, grasping at all passers-by, scanning the face of each to see if there be not among them one dearer than all. But though many an army will pass through the city, never among them will a single one of all their dearest be. Half the Nezamaikovsky kuren was as if it had never been. As the hail suddenly beats down a field where every ear of grain shines like purest gold, so were they beaten down. How the Cossacks hastened thither! How they all started up! How raged Kukubenko, the hetman, when he saw that the best half of his kuren was no more! He fought his way with his remaining Nezamaikovtsi to the very midst of the fray, cut down in his wrath like a cabbage the first man he met, hurled many a rider from his steed, piercing both horse and man with his lance, and making his way to the gunners, captured some of the cannons. Here he found the hetman of the Umansky Kuren and Stepan Guska hard at work, having already seized the largest cannon. He left those Cossacks there and plunged with his own into another mass of the foe, making a lane through it. Where the Nezamaikovtsi passed, there was a street. Where they turned about, there was a square as where streets meet. The foemen's ranks were visibly thinning, and the liaks falling in sheaves. Beside the wagons stood Vovtuzenko, and in front Cherevichenko, and by the more distant ones Degtyarenko, and behind them the Kuren hetman, Vertikvist. Degtyarenko had pierced 2 liaks with his spear and now attacked a third, a stout antagonist. Agile and strong was the liak, with glittering arms and accompanied by 50 followers. He fell fiercely upon Degtyarenko, struck him to the earth, and flourishing his sword above him, cried, "There is not one of you Cossack dogs who has dared to oppose me." "Here is one," said Moses Shiloh, and stepped forward. He was a muscular Cossack, who had often commanded at sea and undergone many vicissitudes. The Turks had once seized him and his men at Trebizond and borne them captives to the galleys, where they bound them hand and foot with iron chains, gave them no food for a week at a time, and made them drink seawater. The poor prisoners endured and suffered all, but would not renounce their orthodox faith. Their hetman, Moses Shiloh, could not bear it. He trampled the holy scriptures underfoot, wound the vile turban about his sinful head, and became the favorite of a pasha, steward of a ship, and ruler over all the galley slaves. The poor slaves sorrowed greatly thereat, for they knew that if he had renounced his faith, he would be a tyrant, and his hand would be the more heavy and severe upon them. So it turned out. Moses Shiloh had them put in new chains, 3 to an oar. The cruel fetters cut to the very bone, and he beat them upon the back. But when the Turks, rejoicing at having obtained such a servant, began to carouse, and forgetful of their law, got all drunk, he distributed all the 64 keys among the prisoners, in order that they might free themselves, fling their chains and manacles into the sea, and seizing their swords, in turn kill the Turks. Then the Cossacks collected great booty and returned with glory to their country, and the guitar players celebrated Moses Shiloh's exploits for a long time. They would have elected him Koshevoy, but he was a very eccentric Cossack. At one time he would perform some feat which the most sagacious would never have dreamed of. At another, folly simply took possession of him, and he drank and squandered everything away, was in debt to everyone in the Setch, and in addition to that, stole like a street thief. He carried off a whole Cossack equipment from a strange Kuren by night, and pawned it to the tavern keeper. For this dishonorable act, they bound him to a post in the bazaar and laid a club beside him in order that everyone who passed should, according to the measure of his strength, deal him a blow. But there was not one Zaporozhets out of them all to be found who would raise the club against him, remembering his former services. Such was the Cossack, Moses Shiloh. "Here is one who will kill you, dog," he said, springing upon the liak. How they hacked away! Their shoulder plates and breastplates bent under their blows. The hostile liak cut through Shiloh's shirt of mail, reaching the body itself with his blade. The Cossack's shirt was dyed purple, but Shiloh heeded it not. He brandished his brawny hand, heavy indeed was that mighty fist, and brought the pommel of his sword down unexpectedly upon his foeman's head. The brazen helmet flew into pieces, and the liak staggered and fell. But Shiloh went on hacking and cutting gashes in the body of the stunned man. Kill not utterly thine enemy, Cossack. Look back, rather. The Cossack did not turn, and one of the dead man's servants plunged a knife into his neck. Shiloh turned and tried to seize him, but he disappeared amid the smoke of the powder. On all sides rose the roar of matchlocks. Shiloh knew that his wound was mortal. He fell with his hand upon his wound, and said, turning to his comrades, "Farewell, brother gentles, my comrades. May the holy Russian land stand forever, and may it be eternally honored." and as he closed his failing eyes, the Cossack soul fled from his grim body. Then Zadorozhny came forward with his men, Vertikvist issued from the ranks, and Balaban stepped forth. "What now, gentles?" said Tarass, calling to the hetmans by name. "There is yet powder in the powder flasks. The Cossack force is not weakened? The Cossacks do not yield?" "There is yet powder in the flasks, father. The Cossack force is not weakened yet. The Cossacks yield not." And the Cossacks pressed vigorously on. The foemen's ranks were disordered. The short colonel beat the assembly and ordered 8 painted standards to be displayed to collect his men, who were scattered over all the plain. All the Liaks hastened to the standards, but they had not yet succeeded in ranging themselves in order when the hetman Kukubenko attacked their center again with his Nezamaikovtsi and fell straight upon the stout colonel. The colonel could not resist the attack, and wheeling his horse about, set out at a gallop, but Kukubenko pursued him for a considerable distance, crossed the plain, and prevented him from joining his regiment. Perceiving this from the Kuren on the flank, Stepan Guska set out after him, lasso in hand, bending his head to his horse's neck. Taking advantage of an opportunity, he cast his lasso about his neck at the first attempt. The colonel turned purple in the face, grasped the cord with both hands, and tried to break it. But with a powerful thrust, Stepan drove his lance through his body, and there he remained pinned to the earth. But Guska did not escape his fate. The Cossacks had but time to look round when they beheld Stepan Guska elevated on 4 spears. All the poor fellow succeeded in saying was, "May all our enemies perish, and may the Russian land rejoice forever." And then he yielded up his soul. The Cossacks glanced around, and there was Metelitsa on one side, entertaining the Liaks by dealing blows on the head to one and another. On the other side, the hetman Nevelitsky was attacking with his men, and Zakrutebuga was repulsing and slaying the enemy by the wagons. The third Pisarenko had repulsed a whole squadron from the more distant wagons, and they were still fighting and killing amongst the other wagons, and even upon them. "How now, gentles?" cried Tarass, stepping forward before them all. "Is there still powder in your flasks? Is the Cossack force still strong? Do the Cossacks yield?" "There is still powder in the flasks, father. The Cossack force is still strong. The Cossacks yield not." But Bovdug had already fallen from the wagons. A bullet had struck him just below the heart. The old man collected all his strength and said, "I sorrow not to part from the world. God grant every man such an end. May the Russian land be forever glorious." And Bovdug's spirit flew above to tell the old men who had gone on long before that men still knew how to fight on Russian soil, and better still, that they knew how to die for it and the holy faith. Balaban, hetman of a Kuren, soon after fell to the ground also from a wagon. 3 mortal wounds had he received from a lance, a bullet, and a sword. He had been one of the very best of Cossacks, and had accomplished a great deal as a commander on naval expeditions, but more glorious than all the rest was his raid on the shores of Anatolia. They collected many sequins, much valuable Turkish plunder, caftans, and adornments of every description. But misfortune awaited them on their way back. They came across the Turkish fleet and were fired on by the ships. Half the boats were crushed and overturned, drowning more than one. But the bundles of reeds bound to the sides, Cossack fashion, saved the boats from completely sinking. Balaban rode off at full speed and steered straight in the face of the sun, thus rendering himself invisible to the Turkish ships. All the following night they spent in bailing out the water with pails and their caps, and in repairing the damaged places. They made sails out of their Cossack trousers and, sailing off, escaped from the fastest Turkish vessels. And not only did they arrive unharmed at the Setch, but they brought a gold-embroidered vesture for the archimandrite at the Medjugorski monastery in Kiev, and an icon frame of pure silver for the church in honor of the intercession of the Virgin Mary, which is in Zaporozhye. The guitar players celebrated the daring of Balaban and his Cossacks for a long time afterwards. Now he bowed his head, feeling the pains which precede death, and said quietly, "I am permitted, brother gentles, to die a fine death. 7 have I hewn in pieces, 9 have I pierced with my lance, many have I trampled upon with my horse's hoofs, and I no longer remember how many my bullets have slain. May our Russian land flourish forever." And his spirit fled. "Cossacks, Cossacks, abandon not the flower of your army." Already was Kukubenko surrounded, and 7 men only remained of all the Nezamaikovsky Kuren, exhausted and with garments already stained with their blood. Tarass himself, perceiving their straits, hastened to their rescue, but the Cossacks arrived too late. Before the enemies who surrounded him could be driven off, a spear was buried just below Kukubenko's heart. He sank into the arms of the Cossacks who caught him, and his young blood flowed in a stream, like precious wine brought from the cellar in a glass vessel by careless servants, who, stumbling at the entrance, break the rich flask. The wine streams over the ground, and the master, hastening up, tears his hair, having reserved it, in order that if God should grant him, in his old age, to meet again the comrade of his youth, they might over it recall together former days, when a man enjoyed himself otherwise and better than now. Kukubenko cast his eyes around and said, "I thank God that it has been my lot to die before your eyes, comrades. May they live better who come after us than we have lived. And may our Russian land, beloved by Christ, flourish forever." And his young spirit fled. The angels took it in their arms and bore it to heaven. It will be well with him there. "Sit down at my right hand, Kukubenko," Christ will say to him. "You never betrayed your comrades. You never committed a dishonorable act. You never sold a man into misery. You preserved and defended my church." The death of Kukubenko saddened them all. The Cossack ranks were terribly thinned. Many brave men were missing, but the Cossacks still stood their ground. "How now, gentles?" cried Tarass to the remaining Kurens. "Is there still powder in your flasks? Are your swords blunted? Are the Cossack forces wearied? Have the Cossacks given way?" "There is still an abundance of powder. Our swords are still sharp. The Cossack forces are not wearied, and the Cossacks have not yet yielded." And the Cossacks again strained every nerve, as though they had suffered no loss. Only 3 Kuren hetmans still remained alive. Red blood flowed in streams everywhere. Heaps of their bodies and of those of the enemy were piled high. Tarass looked up to heaven, and there already hovered a flock of vultures. Well, there would be prey for someone. And there the foe were raising metallica on their lances, and the head of the second Pisarenko was dizzily opening and shutting its eyes, and the mangled body of Okrim Guska fell upon the ground. "Now," said Tarass, and waved a cloth on high. Ostap understood this signal, and springing quickly from his ambush, attacked sharply. The Liaks could not withstand this onslaught, and he drove them back and chased them straight to the spot where the stakes and fragments of spears were driven into the earth. The horses began to stumble and fall, and the Liaks to fly over their heads. At that moment the Korsunci, who had stood till the last by the baggage wagons, perceived that they still had some bullets left, and suddenly fired a volley from their matchlocks. The Liaks became confused and lost their presence of mind, and the Cossacks took courage. "The victory is ours," rang Cossack voices on all sides. The trumpet sounded, and the banner of victory was unfurled. The beaten Liaks ran in all directions and hid themselves. "No, the victory is not yet complete," said Tarass, glancing at the city gate, and he was right. The gates opened, and out dashed a hussar band, the flower of all the cavalry. Every rider was mounted on a matched brown horse from the Kabadai, and in front rode the handsomest, the most heroic of them all. His black hair streamed from beneath his brazen helmet, and from his arm floated a rich scarf embroidered by the hands of a peerless beauty. Tarass sprang back in horror when he saw that it was Andriy, and the latter, meanwhile, enveloped in the dust and heat of battle, eager to deserve the scarf which had been bound as a gift upon his arm, flew on like a greyhound, the handsomest, most agile, and youngest of all the band. The experienced huntsman urges on the greyhound, and he springs forward, tossing up the snow, and a score of times outrunning the hare in the ardour of his course. And so it was with Andriy. Old Tarass paused and observed how he cleared a path before him, hewing away and dealing blows to the right and the left. Tarass could not restrain himself, but shouted, "Your comrades! Your comrades! You devil's brat! Would you kill your own comrades?" But Andriy distinguished not who stood before him, comrades or strangers. He saw nothing. Curls, long curls were what he saw, and a bosom like that of a river swan, and a snowy neck and shoulders, and all that is created for rapturous kisses. "Hey there, lads! Only draw him to the forest, entice him to the forest for me," shouted Tarass. Instantly, 30 of the smartest Cossacks volunteered to entice him thither, and setting their tall caps firmly spurred their horses straight at a gap in the hussars. They attacked the front ranks in flank, beat them down, cut them off from the rear ranks, and slew many of them. Golopuitenko struck Andrei on the back with his sword and immediately set out to ride away at the top of his speed. How Andrei flew after him! How his young blood coursed through all his veins! Driving his sharp spurs into his horse's flanks, he tore along after the Cossacks, never glancing back, and not perceiving that only 20 men at the most were following him. The Cossacks fled at full gallop and directed their course straight for the forest. Andrei overtook them and was on the point of catching Golopuitenko when a powerful hand seized his horse's bridle. Andrei looked. Before him stood Tarass. He trembled all over and turned suddenly pale, like a student who, receiving a blow on the forehead with a ruler, flushes up like fire, springs in wrath from his seat to chase his comrade, and suddenly encounters his teacher entering the classroom. In the instant, his wrathful impulse calms down, and his futile anger vanishes. In this wise, in an instant, Andrei's wrath was as if it had never existed, and he beheld before him only his terrible father. "Well, what are we going to do now?" said Tarass, looking him straight in the eyes, but Andrei could make no reply to this and stood with his eyes fixed on the ground. "Well, son, did your liaks help you?" Andrei made no answer. "To think that you should be such a traitor, that you should betray your faith, betray your comrades, dismount from your horse." Obedient as a child, he dismounted and stood before Tarass more dead than alive. "Stand still, do not move. I gave you life, I will also kill you," said Tarass, and retreating a step backwards, he brought his gun up to his shoulder. Andrei was white as a sheet. His lips moved gently, and he uttered a name. But it was not the name of his native land, nor of his mother, nor his brother. It was the name of the beautiful Pole. Tarass fired. Like the ear of corn cut down by the reaping hook, like the young lamb when it feels the deadly steel in its heart, he hung his head and rolled upon the grass without uttering a word. The murderer of his son stood still and gazed long upon the lifeless body. Even in death he was very handsome. His manly face, so short a time ago filled with power and with an irresistible charm for every woman, still had a marvelous beauty. His black brows, like sombre velvet, set off his pale features. "Is he not a true Cossack?" said Tarass. "He is tall of stature and black-browed. His face is that of a noble, and his hand was strong in battle. He is fallen, fallen without glory, like a vile dog." "Father, what have you done? Was it you who killed him?" said Ostap, coming up at this moment. Tarass nodded. Ostap gazed intently at the dead man. He was sorry for his brother, and said at once, "Let us give him honorable burial, father, that the foe may not dishonor his body, nor the birds of prey rend it." "They will bury him without our help," said Tarass. "There will be plenty of mourners and rejoicers for him." And he reflected for a couple of minutes whether he should fling him to the wolves for prey, or respect in him the bravery which every brave man is bound to honor in another, no matter whom. Then he saw Golopuitenko galloping towards them and crying, "Woe, hetman! The liaks have been reinforced. A fresh force has come to their rescue." Golopuitenko had not finished speaking when Vovtuzenko galloped up. "Woe, hetman! A fresh force is bearing down upon us." Vovtuzenko had not finished speaking when Pisarenko rushed up without his horse. "Where are you, father? The Cossacks are seeking for you. Hetman Nevelichki is killed, Zadorozhny is killed, and Cherevichenko. But the Cossacks stand their ground. They will not die without looking in your eyes. They want you to gaze upon them once more before the hour of death arrives." "To horse, Ostap," said Tarass, and hastened to find his Cossacks, to look once more upon them, and let them behold their hetman once more before the hour of death. But before they could emerge from the wood, the enemy's force had already surrounded it on all sides, and horsemen armed with swords and spears appeared everywhere between the trees. "Ostap! Ostap! Don't yield!" shouted Tarass, and grasping his sword, he began to cut down all he encountered on every side. But 6 suddenly sprang upon Ostap. They did it in an unpropitious hour. The head of one flew off, another turned to flee. A spear pierced the ribs of a third. A fourth, more bold, bent his head to escape the bullet, and the bullet striking his horse's breast, the maddened animal reared, fell back upon the earth, and crushed his rider under him. "Well done, son! Well done, Ostap!" cried Tarass. "I am following you," and he drove off those who attacked him. Tarass hewed and fought, dealing blows at one after another, but still keeping his eye upon Ostap ahead. He saw that 8 more were falling upon his son. "Ostap! Ostap! Don't yield!" But they had already overpowered Ostap. One had flung his lasso about his neck, and they had bound him and were carrying him away. "Hey! Ostap! Ostap!" shouted Tarass, forcing his way towards him and cutting men down like cabbages to right and left. "Hey! Ostap! Ostap!" But something at that moment struck him like a heavy stone. All grew dim and confused before his eyes. In one moment there flashed confusedly before him heads, spears, smoke, the gleam of fire, tree trunks and leaves, and then he sank heavily to the earth like a felled oak, and darkness covered his eyes. Chapter 10. "I have slept a long while," said Tarass, coming to his senses, as if after a heavy drunken sleep, and trying to distinguish the objects about him. A terrible weakness overpowered his limbs. The walls and corners of a strange room were dimly visible before him. At length he perceived that Tovkatch was seated beside him, apparently listening to his every breath. "Yes," thought Tovkatch, "you might have slept forever." But he said nothing, only shook his finger and motioned him to be silent. "But tell me where I am now," asked Tarass, straining his mind and trying to recollect what had taken place. "Be silent," cried his companion sternly. "Why should you want to know? Don't you see that you are all hacked to pieces? Here I have been galloping with you for 2 weeks without taking a breath, and you have been burnt up with fever and talking nonsense. This is the first time you have slept quietly. Be silent if you don't wish to do yourself an injury." But Tarass still tried to collect his thoughts and to recall what had passed. "Well, the Liaks must have surrounded and captured me. I had no chance of fighting my way clear from the throng." "Be silent, I tell you, you devil's brat," cried Tovkatch angrily, as a nurse, driven beyond her patience, cries out at her unruly charge. "What good will it do you to know how you got away? It is enough that you did get away. Some people were found who would not abandon you. Let that be enough for you. It is something for me to have ridden all night with you. You think that you passed for a common Cossack? No, they have offered a reward of 2,000 ducats for your head." "And Ostap!" cried Tarass suddenly, and tried to rise, for all at once he recollected that Ostap had been seized and bound before his very eyes, and that he was now in the hands of the Liaks. Grief overpowered him. He pulled off and tore in pieces the bandages from his wounds and threw them far from him. He tried to say something, but only articulated some incoherent words. Fever and delirium seized upon him afresh, and he uttered wild and incoherent speeches. Meanwhile, his faithful comrade stood beside him, scolding and showering harsh, reproachful words upon him without stint. Finally, he seized him by the arms and legs, wrapped him up like a child, arranged all his bandages, rolled him in an ox hide, bound him with bast, and fastening him with ropes to his saddle, rode with him again at full speed along the road. "I'll get you there, even if it be not alive. I will not abandon your body for the Liaks to make merry over you, and cut your body in twain and fling it into the water. Let the eagle tear out your eyes if it must be so, but let it be our eagle of the steppe, and not a Polish eagle, not one which has flown hither from Polish soil. I will bring you, though it be a corpse, to the Ukraine." Thus spoke his faithful companion. He rode without drawing rein day and night. and brought Tarass still insensible into the Zaporozhian Setch itself. There he undertook to cure him with unswerving care by the aid of herbs and liniments. He sought out a skilled Jewess who made Tarass drink various potions for a whole month, and at length he improved. Whether it was owing to the medicine or to his iron constitution gaining the upper hand, at all events, in 6 weeks he was on his feet. His wounds had closed, and only the scars of the saber cuts showed how deeply injured the old Cossack had been. But he was markedly sad and morose. 3 deep wrinkles engraved themselves upon his brow, and never more departed thence. Then he looked around him. All was new in the Setch. All his old companions were dead. Not one was left of those who had stood up for the right, for faith and brotherhood, and those who had gone forth with the Koshevoy in pursuit of the Tatars, they also had long since disappeared. All had perished. One had lost his head in battle, another had died for lack of food amid the salt marshes of the Crimea, another had fallen in captivity and been unable to survive the disgrace. Their former Koshevoy was no longer living, nor any of his old companions, and the grass was growing over those once alert with power. He felt as one who had given a feast, a great noisy feast. All the dishes had been smashed in pieces. Not a drop of wine was left anywhere. The guests and servants had all stolen valuable cups and platters, and he, like the master of the house, stood sadly thinking that it would have been no feast. In vain did they try to cheer Tarass and to divert his mind. In vain did the long-bearded, grey-haired guitar players come by 2s and 3s to glorify his Cossack deeds. He gazed grimly and indifferently at everything, with inappeasable grief printed on his stolid face, and said softly, as he drooped his head, "My son, my Ostap." The Zaporozhtsi assembled for a raid by sea. 200 boats were launched on the Dnieper, and Asia Minor saw those who manned them with their shaven heads and long scalp locks devote her thriving shores to fire and sword. She saw the turbans of her Mahometan inhabitants strewn, like her innumerable flowers, over the blood-sprinkled fields and floating along her river-banks. She saw many tarry Zaporozhian trousers and strong hands with black hunting whips. The Zaporozhtsi ate up and laid waste all the vineyards. In the mosques they left heaps of dung. They used rich Persian shawls for sashes and girded their dirty gabardines with them. Long afterwards, short Zaporozhian pipes were found in those regions. They sailed merrily back. A 10-gun Turkish ship pursued them and scattered their skiffs like birds with a volley from its guns. A third part of them sank in the depths of the sea, but the rest again assembled and gained the mouth of the Dnieper with 12 kegs full of sequins. But all this did not interest Tarass. He went off upon the steppe as though to hunt, but the charge remained in his gun, and laying down the weapon, he would seat himself sadly on the shores of the sea. He sat there long with drooping head, repeating continually, "My Ostap, my Ostap." Before him spread the gleaming Black Sea. In the distant reeds the seagull screamed. His grey moustache turned to silver, and the tears fell one by one upon it. At last Tarass could endure it no longer. "Whatever happens, I must go and find out what he is doing. Is he alive or in the grave? I will know, cost what it may." Within a week he found himself in the city of Uman, fully armed and mounted, with lance, sword, canteen, pot of oatmeal, powder horn, cord to hobble his horse, and other equipments. He went straight to a dirty, ill-kept little house, the small windows of which were almost invisible, blackened as they were with some unknown dirt. The chimney was wrapped in rags, and the roof, which was full of holes, was covered with sparrows. A heap of all sorts of refuse lay before the very door. From the window peered the head of a Jewess in a headdress with discoloured pearls. "Is your husband at home?" said Bulba, dismounting and fastening his horse's bridle to an iron hook beside the door. "He is at home," said the Jewess, and hastened out at once with a measure of corn for the horse and a stoop of beer for the rider. "Where is your Jew?" "He is in the other room at prayer," replied the Jewess, bowing and wishing Bulba good health as he raised the cup to his lips. "Remain here, feed and water my horse, whilst I go speak with him alone. I have business with him." This Jew was the well-known Yankl. He was there as revenue farmer and tavern keeper. He had gradually got nearly all the neighboring noblemen and gentlemen into his hands, had slowly sucked away most of their money, and had strongly impressed his presence on that locality. For a distance of 3 miles in all directions, not a single farm remained in a proper state. All were falling in ruins. All had been drunk away, and poverty and rags alone remained. The whole neighborhood was depopulated, as if after a fire or an epidemic, and if Yankl had lived there 10 years, he would probably have depopulated the Woiwode's whole domains. Tarass entered the room. The Jew was praying, enveloped in his dirty shroud, and was turning to spit for the last time, according to the forms of his creed, when his eyes suddenly lighted on Tarass standing behind him. The first thing that crossed Yankl's mind was the 2,000 ducats offered for his visitor's head, but he was ashamed of his avarice and tried to stifle within him the eternal thought of gold, which twines like a snake about the soul of a Jew. "Listen, Yankl," said Tarass to the Jew, who began to bow low before him, and as he spoke he shut the door so that they might not be seen. "I saved your life. The Zaporozhtzi would have torn you to pieces like a dog. Now it is your turn to do me a service." The Jew's face clouded over a little. "What service? If it is a service I can render, why should I not render it?" "Ask no questions. Take me to Warsaw." "To Warsaw?" "Why to Warsaw?" said the Jew, and his brows and shoulders rose in amazement. "Ask me nothing. Take me to Warsaw. I must see him once more at any cost, and say one word to him." "Say a word to whom?" "To him, to Ostap, to my son. Has not my lord heard that already?" I know all. They offer 2,000 ducats for my head. They know its value, fools. I will give you 5,000. Here are 2,000 on the spot." And Bulba poured out 2,000 ducats from a leather purse, and the rest when I return. The Jew instantly seized a towel and concealed the ducats under it. "Aye, glorious money. Aye, good money," he said, twirling one gold piece in his hand and testing it with his teeth. "I don't believe the man from whom my lord took these fine gold pieces remained in the world an hour longer. He went straight to the river and drowned himself after the loss of such magnificent gold pieces. I should not have asked you. I might possibly have found my own way to Warsaw, but someone might recognize me, and then the cursed Liaks would capture me, for I am not clever at inventions, whilst that is just what you Jews are created for. You would deceive the very devil. You know every trick. That is why I have come to you. And besides, I could do nothing of myself in Warsaw. Harness the horse to your wagon at once, and take me. And my lord thinks that I can take the nag at once and harness him and say, 'Get up, Dapple.' My lord thinks that I can take him just as he is, without concealing him. Well, hide me as you like, in an empty cask." "Aye, aye, and my lord thinks he can be concealed in an empty cask. Does not my lord know that every man thinks that every cask he sees contains brandy?" "Well, let them think it is brandy. Let them think it is brandy," said the Jew, and grasped his earlocks with both hands, and then raised them both on high. "Well, why are you so frightened? And does not my lord know that God has made brandy expressly for everyone to sip? They are all gluttons and fond of dainties there. A nobleman will run 5 versts after a cask. He will make a hole in it, and as soon as he sees that nothing runs out, he will say, 'A Jew does not carry empty casks. There is certainly something wrong. Seize the Jew, bind the Jew, take away all the Jew's money, put the Jew in prison.' Then all the vile people will fall upon the Jew, for everyone takes a Jew for a dog, and they think he is not a man, but only a Jew. Then put me in the wagon with some fish over me." "I cannot, my lord. By heaven, I cannot. All over Poland the people are as hungry as dogs now. They will steal the fish and feel my lord." "Then take me in the fiend's way, only take me." Listen, my lord," said the Jew, turning up the ends of his sleeves and approaching him with extended arms. "This is what we will do. They are building fortresses and castles everywhere. French engineers have come from Germany. and so a great deal of brick and stone is being carried over the roads. Let my lord lie down in the bottom of the wagon, and over him I will pile bricks. My lord is strong and well, apparently, so he will not mind if it is a little heavy, and I will make a hole in the bottom of the wagon in order to feed my lord. Do what you will, only take me." In an hour, a wagon load of bricks left Oman, drawn by two sorry nags. On one of them sat tall Yankl, his long, curling earlocks flowing from beneath his Jewish cap as he bounced about on the horse like a verst mark planted by the roadside. Chapter 11. At the time when these things took place, there were as yet on the frontiers neither custom-house officials nor guards, those bugbears of enterprising people, so that anyone could bring across anything he fancied. If anyone made a search or inspection, he did it chiefly for his own pleasure, especially if there happened to be in the wagon objects attractive to his eye, and if his own hand possessed a certain weight and power. But the bricks found no admirers, and they entered the principal gate unmolested. Bulba, in his narrow cage, could only hear the noise, the shouts of the driver, and nothing more. Yankl, bouncing up and down on his dust-covered nag, turned, after making several detours, into a dark, narrow street, bearing the names of the Muddy and also of the Jews' Street, because Jews from nearly every part of Warsaw were to be found here. This street greatly resembled a backyard turned wrong side out. The sun never seemed to shine into it. The black wooden houses, with numerous poles projecting from the windows, still further increased the darkness. Rarely did a brick wall gleam red among them, for these too, in many places, had turned quite black. Here and there, high up, a bit of stuccoed wall illumined by the sun glistened with intolerable whiteness. Pipes, rags, shells, broken and discarded tubs, everyone flung whatever was useless to him into the street, thus affording the passer-by an opportunity of exercising all his five senses with the rubbish. A man on horseback could almost touch with his hand the poles thrown across the street from one house to another, upon which hung Jewish stockings, short trousers, and smoked geese. Sometimes a pretty little Hebrew face, adorned with discolored pearls, peeped out of an old window. A group of little Jews, with torn and dirty garments and curly hair, screamed and rolled about in the dirt. A red-haired Jew, with freckles all over his face, which made him look like a sparrow's egg, gazed from a window. He addressed Yankl at once in his gibberish, and Yankl at once drove into a courtyard. Another Jew came along, halted, and entered into conversation. When Bulba finally emerged from beneath the bricks, he beheld three Jews talking with great warmth. Yankl turned to him and said that everything possible would be done, that his Ostap was in the city jail, and that although it would be difficult to persuade the jailer, yet he hoped to arrange a meeting. Bulba entered the room with the three Jews. The Jews again began to talk among themselves in their incomprehensible tongue. Tarass looked hard at each of them. Something seemed to have moved him deeply. Over his rough and stolid countenance a flame of hope spread, of hope such as sometimes visits a man in the last depths of his despair. His aged heart began to beat violently as though he had been a youth. "Listen, Jews," said he, and there was a triumphant ring in his words. "You can do anything in the world, even extract things from the bottom of the sea, and it has long been a proverb that a Jew will steal from himself if he takes a fancy to steal. Set my Ostap at liberty. Give him a chance to escape from their diabolical hands. I promise this man 5,000 ducats. I will add another 5,000. All that I have, rich cups, buried gold, houses, all, even to my last garment, I will part with. And I will enter into a contract with you for my whole life, to give you half of all the booty I may gain in war." "Oh, impossible, dear lord, it is impossible," said Yankl with a sigh. "Impossible," said another Jew. All three Jews looked at each other. "We might try," said the third, glancing timidly at the other two. "God may favor us." All three Jews discussed the matter in German. Bulba, in spite of his straining ears, could make nothing of it. He only caught the word Mardochai, often repeated. "Listen, my lord," said Yankl. We must consult with a man such as there never was before in the world. Ugh, ugh, as wise as Solomon, and if he will do nothing, then no one in the world can. Sit here, this is the key. Admit no one. The Jews went out into the street. Tarass locked the door and looked out from the little window upon the dirty Jewish street. The three Jews halted in the middle of the street and began to talk with a good deal of warmth. A fourth soon joined them, and finally a fifth. Again he heard repeated, "Mardochai, Mardochai." The Jews glanced incessantly towards one side of the street. At length, from a dirty house near the end of it, emerged a foot in a Jewish shoe and the skirts of a caftan. "Ah, Mardochai, Mardochai!" shouted the Jews in one voice. A thin Jew, somewhat shorter than Yankl, but even more wrinkled, and with a huge upper lip, approached the impatient group, and all the Jews made haste to talk to him, interrupting each other. During the recital, Mardochai glanced several times towards the little window, and Tarass divined that the conversation concerned him. Mardochai waved his hands, listened, interrupted, spat frequently to one side, and, pulling up the skirts of his caftan, thrust his hand into his pocket and drew out some jingling thing, showing very dirty trousers in the operation. Finally, all the Jews set up such a shouting that the Jew who was standing guard was forced to make a signal for silence, and Tarass began to fear for his safety. But when he remembered that Jews can only consult in the street and that the demon himself cannot understand their language, he regained his composure. 2 minutes later, the Jews all entered the room together. Mardochai approached Tarass, tapped him on the shoulder, and said, "When we set to work, it will be all right." Tarass looked at this Solomon, whom the world had never known, and conceived some hope. Indeed, his face might well inspire confidence. His upper lip was simply an object of horror, its thickness being doubtless increased by adventitious circumstances. This Solomon's beard consisted only of about 15 hairs, and they were on the left side. Solomon's face bore so many scars of battle received for his daring that he had doubtless lost count of them long before, and had grown accustomed to consider them as birthmarks. Mardochai departed, accompanied by his comrades, who were filled with admiration at his wisdom. Bulba remained alone. He was in a strange, unaccustomed situation for the first time in his life. He felt uneasy. His mind was in a state of fever. He was no longer unbending, immovable, strong as an oak, as he had formerly been, but felt timid and weak. He trembled at every sound, at every fresh Jewish face which showed itself at the end of the street. In this condition he passed the whole day. He neither ate nor drank, and his eye never for a moment left the small window looking on the street. Finally, late at night, Mardochai and Yankl made their appearance. Tarass's heart died within him. "What news? Have you been successful?" he asked, with the impatience of a wild horse. But before the Jews had recovered breath to answer, Tarass perceived that Mardochai no longer had the locks which had formerly fallen in greasy curls from under his felt cap. It was evident that he wished to say something, but he uttered only nonsense which Tarass could make nothing of. Yankl himself put his hand very often to his mouth, as though suffering from a cold. "Oh, dearest lord," said Yankl, "it is quite impossible now, by heaven, impossible. Such vile people that they deserve to be spit upon. Mardochai here says the same. Mardochai has done what no man in the world ever did, but God did not will that it should be so. 3,000 soldiers are in garrison here, and tomorrow the prisoners are all to be executed." Tarass looked the Jew straight in the face, but no longer with impatience or anger. "But if my lord wishes to see his son, then it must be early tomorrow morning before the sun has risen. The sentinels have consented, and one jailer has promised. But may he have no happiness in the world. Woe is me! What greedy people! There are none such among us. I gave 50 ducats to each sentinel and to the jailer." "Good. Take me to him," exclaimed Tarass, with decision and with all his firmness of mind restored. He agreed to Yankl's proposition that he should disguise himself as a foreign count just arrived from Germany, for which purpose the prudent Jew had already provided a costume. It was already night. The master of the house, The red-haired Jew with freckles pulled out a mattress covered with some kind of rug and spread it on a bench for Bulba. Yankl lay upon the floor on a similar mattress. The red-haired Jew drank a small cup of brandy, took off his kaftan, and betook himself, looking, in his shoes and stockings, very like a lean chicken, with his wife, to something resembling a cupboard. Two little Jews lay down on the floor beside the cupboard like a couple of dogs. But Tarass did not sleep. He sat motionless, drumming on the table with his fingers. He kept his pipe in his mouth and puffed out smoke, which made the Jew sneeze in his sleep and pull his coverlet over his nose. Scarcely was the sky touched with the first faint gleams of dawn than he pushed Yankl with his foot, saying, "Rise, Jew, and give me your count's dress." In a moment he was dressed. He blackened his moustache and eyebrows, put on his head a small dark cap. Even the Cossacks who knew him best would not have recognized him. Apparently he was not more than 35. A healthy color glowed on his cheeks, and his scars lent him an air of command. The gold-embroidered dress became him extremely well. The streets were still asleep. Not a single one of the market folk as yet showed himself in the city, with his basket on his arm. Yankl and Bulba made their way to a building which presented the appearance of a crouching stork. It was large, low, wide, and black, and on one side a long, slender tower like a stork's neck projected above the roof. This building served for a variety of purposes. It was a barrack, a jail, and the criminal court. The visitors entered the gate and found themselves in a vast room or covered courtyard. About 1,000 men were sleeping here. Straight before them was a small door, in front of which sat two sentries playing at some game, which consisted in one striking the palm of the other's hand with 2 fingers. They paid little heed to the new arrivals, and only turned their heads when Yankl said, "It is we, sirs. Do you hear? It is we." "Go in," said one of them, opening the door with one hand and holding out the other to his comrade to receive his blows. They entered a low and dark corridor, which led them to a similar room with small windows overhead. "Who goes there?" shouted several voices, and Tarass beheld a number of warriors in full armor. "We have been ordered to admit no one." "It is we," cried Yankl. "We, by heavens, noble sirs." But no one would listen to him. Fortunately, at that moment a fat man came up, who appeared to be a commanding officer, for he swore louder than all the others. "My lord, it is we. You know us, and the Lord Count will thank you. Admit them, 100 fiends, and mother of fiends. Admit no one else, and no one is to draw his sword, nor quarrel." The conclusion of this order the visitors did not hear. "It is we. It is I. It is your friends," Yankl said to everyone they met. "Well, can it be managed now?" he inquired of one of the guards, when they at length reached the end of the corridor. "It is possible, but I don't know whether you will be able to gain admission to the prison itself. Yana is not here now. Another man is keeping watch in his place," replied the guard. "Aye, aye," cried the Jew softly. "This is bad, my dear lord." "Go on," said Tarass firmly, and the Jew obeyed. At the arched entrance of the vault stood a heyduke, with a moustache trimmed in 3 layers. The upper layer was trained backwards, the second straight forward, and the third downwards, which made him greatly resemble a cat. The Jew shrank into nothing and approached him almost sideways. "Your High Excellency, high and illustrious lord." "Are you speaking to me, Jew?" "To you, illustrious lord." But I am merely a heyduke," said the merry-eyed man with the triple-tiered moustache. "And I thought it was the Wywode himself, by heavens! I. Thereupon the Jew twisted his head about and spread out his fingers. "Aye, what a fine figure! Another finger's breadth, and he would be a colonel. The Lord no doubt rides a horse as fleet as the wind and commands the troops." The heyduke twirled the lower tier of his moustache, and his eyes beamed. "What a warlike people," continued the Jew. "Ah, woe is me, what a fine race! Golden cords and trappings that shine like the sun, and the maidens, wherever they see warriors, aye. Again the Jew wagged his head. The heyduke twirled his upper moustache and uttered a sound somewhat resembling the neighing of a horse. "I pray my lord to do us a service," exclaimed the Jew. "This prince has come hither from a foreign land and wants to get a look at the Cossacks. He never, in all his life, has seen what sort of people the Cossacks are." The advent of foreign counts and barons was common enough in Poland. They were often drawn thither by curiosity to view this half-Asiatic corner of Europe. They regarded Moscow and the Ukraine as situated in Asia. So the heyduke bowed low and thought fit to add a few words of his own. "I do not know, your excellency," said he, "why you should desire to see them. They are dogs, not men, and their faith is such as no one respects." "You lie, you son of Satan!" exclaimed Bulba. "You are a dog yourself. How dare you say that our faith is not respected? It is your heretical faith which is not respected." "Oh ho," said the heyduke. "I can guess who you are, my friend. You are one of the breed of those under my charge. So just wait while I summon our men." Tarass realized his indiscretion, but vexation and obstinacy hindered him from devising a means of remedying it. Fortunately, Yankl managed to interpose at this moment, ::. "Most noble lord, how is it possible that the count can be a Cossack? If he were a Cossack, where could have he obtained such a dress and such a count-like mien?" "Explain that yourself." And the heyduke opened his wide mouth to shout. "Your Royal Highness, silence! Silence! For heaven's sake!" cried Yankl. "Silence! We will pay you for it in a way you never dreamed of. We will give you 2 golden ducats." "Oh ho, 2 ducats! I can't do anything with 2 ducats. I give my barber 2 ducats for only shaving the half of my beard. Give me 100 ducats, Jew." Here the heyduke twirled his upper moustache. "If you don't, I will shout at once." "Why so much?" said the Jew, sadly, turning pale and undoing his leather purse. But it was lucky that he had no more in it, and that the heyduke could not count over 100. My lord, let us depart quickly." "Look at the evil-minded fellow," said Yankl to Tarass, perceiving that the heyduke was turning the money over in his hand, as though regretting that he had not demanded more. "What do you mean, you devil of a heyduke?" said Bulba. "What do you mean by taking our money and not letting us see the Cossacks? No, you must let us see them. Since you have taken the money, you have no right to refuse. Go. Go to the devil. If you won't, I'll give the alarm this moment. Take yourselves off quickly, I say." My lord, let us go. In God's name, let us go. Curse him. May he dream such things that he will have to spit," cried poor Yankl. Bulba turned slowly, with drooping head, and retraced his steps, followed by the complaints of Yankl, who was sorrowing at the thought of the wasted ducats. "Why be angry? Let the dog curse. That race cannot help cursing. Oh, woe is me! What luck God sends to some people. 100 ducats merely for driving us off. And our brother, they have torn off his earlocks, and they made wounds on his face that you cannot bear to look at, and yet no one will give him 100 gold pieces. Oh, heavens, merciful God!" But this failure made a much deeper impression on Bulba, expressed by a devouring flame in his eyes. "Let us go," he said, suddenly, as if arousing himself. "Let us go to the square. I want to see how they will torture him." "Oh, my lord, why go? That will do us no good now." "Let us go," said Bulba, obstinately, and the Jew followed him, sighing like a nurse. The square on which the execution was to take place was not hard to find, for the people were thronging thither from all quarters. In that savage age, such a thing constituted one of the most noteworthy spectacles, not only for the common people, but among the higher classes. A number of the most pious old men, a throng of young girls, and the most cowardly women, who dreamed the whole night afterwards of their bloody corpses, and shrieked as loudly in their sleep as a drunken hussar, missed, nevertheless, no opportunity of gratifying their curiosity. "Ah, what tortures!" many of them would cry, hysterically, covering their eyes and turning away, but they stood their ground for a good while, all the same. Many a one, with gaping mouth and outstretched hands, would have liked to jump upon other folks' heads to get a better view. Above the crowd towered a bulky butcher, admiring the whole process with the air of a connoisseur and exchanging brief remarks with a gunsmith, whom he addressed as Gossip, because he got drunk in the same alehouse with him on holidays. Some entered into warm discussions, others even laid wagers, but the majority were of the species who, all the world over, look on at the world and at everything that goes on in it, and merely scratch their noses. In the front ranks, close to the bearded civic guards, stood a young noble in warlike array, who had certainly put his whole wardrobe on his back, leaving only his torn shirt and old shoes at his quarters. 2 chains, one above the other, hung around his neck. He stood beside his mistress, Usisha, and glanced about incessantly to see that no one soiled her silk gown. He explained everything to her so perfectly that no one could have added a word. "All these people whom you see, my dear Usisha," he said, "have come to see the criminals executed. And that man, my love, yonder, holding the axe and other instruments in his hands, is the executioner who will dispatch them. When he begins to break them on the wheel and torture them in other ways, the criminals will still be alive. But when he cuts off their heads, then, my love, they will die at once. Before that, they will cry and move. But as soon as their heads are cut off, it will be impossible for them to cry, or to eat or drink, because, my dear, they will no longer have any head." Usisya listened to all this with terror and curiosity. The upper stories of the houses were filled with people. From the windows in the roof peered strange faces with beards and something resembling caps. Upon the balconies, beneath shady awnings, sat the aristocracy. The hands of smiling young ladies, brilliant as white sugar, rested on the railings. Portly nobles looked on with dignity. Servants in rich garb, with flowing sleeves, handed round various refreshments. Sometimes a black-eyed young rogue would take her cake or fruit and fling it among the crowd with her own noble little hand. The crowd of hungry gentles held up their caps to receive it, and some tall noble, whose head rose amid the throng, with his faded red jacket and discoloured gold braid, and who was the first to catch it with the aid of his long arms, would kiss his booty, press it to his heart, and finally put it in his mouth. The hawk, suspended beneath the balcony in a golden cage, was also a spectator. With beak inclined to one side, and with one foot raised, he too watched the people attentively. But suddenly a murmur ran through the crowd, and a rumor spread. "They are coming! They are coming! The Cossacks!" They were bareheaded, with their long locks floating in the air. Their beards had grown, and their once handsome garments were worn out and hung about them in tatters. They walked neither timidly nor surlily, but with a certain pride, neither looking at nor bowing to the people. At the head of all came Ostap. What were old Tarass's feelings when thus he beheld his Ostap? What filled his heart then? He gazed at him from amid the crowd and lost not a single movement of his. They reached the place of execution. Ostap stopped. He was to be the first to drink the bitter cup. He glanced at his comrades, raised his hand, and said in a loud voice, "God grant that none of the heretics who stand here may hear, the unclean dogs, how Christians suffer. Let none of us utter a single word." After this he ascended the scaffold. "Well done, son. Well done," said Bulba, softly, and bent his grey head. The executioner tore off his old rags. They fastened his hands and feet in stocks prepared expressly, and we will not pain the reader with a picture of the hellish tortures which would make his hair rise upright on his head. They were the outcome of that coarse, wild age when men still led a life of warfare which hardened their souls until no sense of humanity was left in them. In vain did some, not many, in that age make a stand against such terrible measures. In vain did the king and many nobles, enlightened in mind and spirit, demonstrate that such severity of punishment could but fan the flame of vengeance in the Cossack nation. But the power of the king and the opinion of the wise was as nothing before the savage will of the magnates of the kingdom, who, by their thoughtlessness and unconquerable lack of all far-sighted policy, their childish self-love and miserable pride, converted the Diet into the mockery of a government. Ostap endured the torture like a giant. Not a cry, not a groan was heard. even when they began to break the bones in his hands and feet, when, amid the death-like stillness of the crowd, the horrible cracking was audible to the most distant spectators. When even his tormentors turned aside their eyes, nothing like a groan escaped his lips, nor did his face quiver. Tarass stood in the crowd with bowed head, and raising his eyes proudly at that moment, he said approvingly, "Well done, boy, well done." But when they took him to the last deadly tortures, it seemed as though his strength were failing. He cast his eyes around. Oh, God! All strangers, all unknown faces. If only some of his relatives had been present at his death. He would not have cared to hear the sobs and anguish of his poor, weak mother, nor the unreasoning cries of a wife, tearing her hair and beating her white breast. But he would have liked to see a strong man who might refresh him with a word of wisdom and cheer his end. And his strength failed him, and he cried in the weakness of his soul, "Father, where are you? Do you hear?" "I hear," rang through the universal silence, and those thousands of people shuddered in concert. A detachment of cavalry hastened to search through the throng of people. Yankl turned pale as death, and when the horseman had got within a short distance of him, turned round in terror to look for Tarass. But Tarass was no longer beside him. Every trace of him was lost. Chapter 12. They soon found traces of Tarass. An army of 120,000 Cossacks appeared on the frontier of the Ukraine. This was no small detachment sallying forth for plunder or in pursuit of the Tatars. No, the whole nation had risen, for the measure of the people's patience was over full. They had risen to avenge the disregard of their rights, the dishonorable humiliation of themselves, the insults to the faith of their fathers and their sacred customs, the outrages upon their church, the excesses of the foreign nobles, the disgraceful domination of the Jews on Christian soil, and all that had aroused and deepened the stern hatred of the Cossacks for a long time past. Hetman Ostranitsa, young but firm in mind, led the vast Cossack force. Beside him was seen his old and experienced friend and counselor, Gunya. 8 leaders led bands of 12,000 men each. 2 Osuls and a Bunchuzhny assisted the hetman. A cornet general carried the chief standard, whilst many other banners and standards floated in the air, and the comrades of the staff bore the golden staff of the hetman, the symbol of his office. There were also many other officials belonging to the different bands, the baggage train, and the main force with detachments of infantry and cavalry. There were almost as many free Cossacks and volunteers as there were registered Cossacks. The Cossacks had risen everywhere. They came from Chigirin, from Pereyaslav, from Baturin, from Glukov, from the regions of the lower Dnieper, and from all its upper shores and islands. An uninterrupted stream of horses and herds of cattle stretched across the plain, and among all these Cossacks, among all these bands, one was the choicest, and that was the band led by Tarass Boolba. All contributed to give him an influence over the others. His advanced years, his experience and skill in directing an army, and his bitter hatred of the foe. His unsparing fierceness and cruelty seemed exaggerated even to the Cossacks. His grey head dreamed of naught save fire and sword, and his utterances at the councils of war breathed only annihilation. It is useless to describe all the battles in which the Cossacks distinguished themselves, or the gradual courses of the campaign. All this is set down in the chronicles. It is well known what an army raised on Russian soil for the Orthodox faith is like. There is no power stronger than faith. It is threatening and invincible like a rock, and rising amidst the stormy, ever-changing sea. From the very bottom of the sea, it rears to heaven, its jagged sides of firm, impenetrable stone. It is visible from everywhere, and looks the waves straight in the face as they roll past. And woe to the ship which is dashed against it. Its frame flies into splinters, everything in it is split and crushed, and the startled air re-echoes the piteous cries of the drowning. In the pages of the chronicles there is a minute description of how the Polish garrisons fled from the freed cities, how the unscrupulous Jewish tavern-keepers were hung, how powerless was the royal hetman, Nikolai Potocki, with his numerous army, against this invincible force, how, routed and pursued, he lost the best of his troops by drowning in a small stream, how the fierce Cossack regiments besieged him in the little town of Polon, and how, reduced to extremities, he promised under oath on the part of the king and the government its full satisfaction to all and the restoration of all their rights and privileges. But the Cossacks were not men to give way for this. They already knew well what a Polish oath was worth. And Potocki would never more have pranced on his 6,000 ducat horse from the Kabadai, attracting the glances of distinguished ladies and the envy of the nobility. He would never more have made a figure in the Diet by giving costly feasts to the senators, if the Russian priests who were in the little town had not saved him. When all the popes, in their brilliant gold vestments, went out to meet the Cossacks, bearing the holy pictures and the cross, with the bishop himself at their head, crozier in hand and mitre on his head, the Cossacks all bowed their heads and took off their caps. To no one lower than the king himself would they have shown respect at such an hour, but their daring fell before the Church of Christ, and they honoured their priesthood. The hetman and leaders agreed to release Potocki after having extracted from him a solemn oath to leave all the Christian churches unmolested, to forswear the ancient enmity, and to do no harm to the Cossack forces. One leader alone would not consent to such a peace. It was Tarass. He tore a handful of hair from his head and cried, "Hetman and leaders, commit no such womanish deed. Trust not the liaks. Slay the dogs." When the secretary presented the agreement, and the hetman put his hand to it, Tarass drew a genuine Damascene blade, a costly Turkish sabre of the finest steel, broke it in twain like a reed, and threw the two pieces far away on each side, saying, "Farewell, as the two pieces of this sword will never reunite and form one sword again, so we, comrades, shall never more behold each other in this world. Remember my parting words." As he spoke, his voice grew stronger, rose higher, and acquired a hitherto unknown power, and his prophetic utterances troubled them all. "Before the death hour you will remember me. Do you think that you have purchased peace and quiet? Do you think that you will make a great show? You will make a great show, but after another fashion. They will flay the skin from your head, hetman. They will stuff it with bran, and long will it be exhibited at fairs. Neither will you retain your heads, gentles. You will be thrown into damp dungeons, walled about with stone, if they do not boil you alive in cauldrons like sheep. And you, men," he continued, turning to his followers, "which of you wants to die his true death? Not through sorrows and the alehouse, but an honourable Cossack death, all in one bed, like bride and groom. But perhaps you would like to return home and turn infidels and carry Polish priests on your backs." "We will follow you, noble leader, we will follow you," shouted all his band, and many others joined them. "If it is to be so, then follow me," said Tarass, pulling his cap farther over his brows. Looking menacingly at the others, he went to his horse and cried to his men, "Let no one reproach us with any insulting speeches. Now hey there, men, we'll call on the Catholics." And then he struck his horse, and there followed him a camp of 100 wagons, and with them many Cossack cavalry and infantry, and turning, he threatened with a glance all who remained behind, and wrath was in his eye. The band departed in full view of all the army, and Tarass continued long to turn and glower. The hetman and leaders were uneasy, all became thoughtful, and remained silent, as though oppressed by some heavy foreboding. Not in vain had Tarass prophesied. All came to pass as he had foretold. A little later, after the treacherous attack at Canova, the hetman's head was mounted on a stake, together with those of many of his officers. And what of Tarass? Tarass made raids all over Poland with his band, burned 18 towns and nearly 40 churches, and reached Krakow. He killed many nobles and plundered some of the richest and finest castles. The Cossacks emptied on the ground the century-old mead and wine, carefully hoarded up in lordly cellars. They cut and burned the rich garments and equipments which they found in the wardrobes. "Spare nothing," was the order of Tarass. The Cossacks spared not the black-browed gentlewomen, the brilliant, white-bosomed maidens. These could not save themselves even at the altar, for Tarass burned them with the altar itself. Snowy hands were raised to heaven from amid fiery flames, with piteous shrieks which would have moved the damp earth itself to pity and caused the steppe grass to bend with compassion at their fate. But the cruel Cossacks paid no heed, and raising the children in the streets upon the points of their lances, they cast them also into the flames. "This is a mass for the soul of Ostap, you heathen Liaks," was all that Tarass said. And such masses for Ostap he had sung in every village, until the Polish government perceived that Tarass's raids were more than ordinary expeditions for plunder, and Potocki was given 5 regiments and ordered to capture him without fail. 6 days did the Cossacks retreat along the byroads before their pursuers. Their horses were almost equal to this unchecked flight and nearly saved them, but this time Potocki was also equal to the task entrusted to him. Unweariedly he followed them and overtook them on the bank of the Dniester, where Tarass had taken possession of an abandoned and ruined castle for the purpose of resting. On the very brink of the Dniester it stood, with its shattered ramparts and the ruined remnants of its walls. The summit of the cliff was strewn with ragged stones and broken bricks, ready at any moment to detach themselves. The royal hetman, Potocki, surrounded it on the 2 sides which faced the plain. 4 days did the Cossacks fight, tearing down bricks and stones for missiles. But their stones and their strength were at length exhausted, and Tarass resolved to cut his way through the beleaguering forces. And the Cossacks would have cut their way through, and their swift steeds might again have served them faithfully, had not Tarass halted suddenly in the very midst of their flight and shouted, "Halt! My pipe has dropped with its tobacco. I won't let those heathen Liaks have my pipe." And the old hetman stooped down and felt in the grass for his pipe full of tobacco, his inseparable companion on all his expeditions by sea and land and at home. But in the meantime a band of Liaks suddenly rushed up and seized him by the shoulders. He struggled with all might, but he could not scatter on the earth, as he had been wont to do, the heydukes who had seized him. "Oh, old age, he exclaimed, and the stout old Cossack wept. But his age was not to blame. Nearly 30 men were clinging to his arms and legs. "The raven is caught," yelled the Liaks. "We must think how we can show him the most honor, the dog." They decided, with the permission of the hetman, to burn him alive in the sight of all. There stood hard by a leafless tree, the summit of which had been struck by lightning. They fastened him with iron chains and nails driven through his hands high up on the trunk of the tree, so that he might be seen from all sides, and began at once to place faggots at its foot. But Tarass did not look at the wood, nor did he think of the fire with which they were preparing to roast him. He gazed anxiously in the direction whence his Cossacks were firing. From his high point of observation he could see everything as in the palm of his hand. "Take possession, men," he shouted, "of the hillock behind the wood. They cannot climb it." But the wind did not carry his words to them. "They are lost, lost," he said in despair, and glanced down to where the water of the Dniester glittered. Joy gleamed in his eyes. He saw the sterns of 4 boats peeping out from behind some bushes, exerted all the power of his lungs, and shouted in a ringing tone, to the bank, men! Descend the path to the left under the cliff. There are boats on the bank. Take all, that they may not catch you." This time the breeze blew from the other side, and his words were audible to the Cossacks. But for this counsel he received a blow on the head with the back of an axe, which made everything dance before his eyes. The Cossacks descended the cliff path at full speed, but their pursuers were at their heels. They looked. The path wound and twisted and made many detours to one side. "Comrades, we are trapped," said they. All halted for an instant, raised their whips, whistled, and their Tatar horses rose from the ground, clove the air like serpents, flew over the precipice, and plunged straight into the Dniester. 2 only did not alight in the river, but thundered down from the height upon the stones, and perished there with their horses without uttering a cry. But the Cossacks had already swum shoreward from their horses and unfastened the boats, when the Liaks halted on the brink of the precipice, astounded by this wonderful feat, and thinking, "Shall we jump down to them, or not?" One young colonel, a lively, hot-blooded soldier, own brother to the beautiful Pole who had seduced poor Andrii, did not reflect long, but leapt with his horse after the Cossacks. He made 3 turns in the air with his steed and fell heavily on the rocks. The sharp stones tore him in pieces, and his brains, mingled with blood, bespattered the shrubs growing on the uneven walls of the precipice. When Tarass Boolba recovered from the blow and glanced towards the Dniester, the Cossacks were already in the skiffs and rowing away. Balls were showered upon them from above, but did not reach them, and the old hetman's eyes sparkled with joy. "Farewell, comrades," he shouted to them from above. "Remember me, and come hither again next spring, and make merry in the same fashion. What, cursed Leax, have ye caught me? Think ye there is anything in the world that a Cossack fears? Wait, the time will come when ye shall learn what the Orthodox Russian faith is. Already the people scent it far and near. A Tsar shall arise from Russian soil, and there shall not be a power in the world which shall not submit to him." But fire had already risen from the faggots, it lapped his feet, and the flames spread to the tree. But can any fire, flames, or power be found on earth which are capable of overpowering Russian strength? Broad is the river Dniester, and in it are many deep pools, dense reed beds, clear shallows, and little bays. Its watery mirror gleams, filled with the melodious plaint of the swan. The proud wild goose glides swiftly over it, and snipe, red-throated ruffs, and other birds are to be found among the reeds and along the banks. The Cossacks rowed swiftly on in the narrow double-ruddered boats, rowed stoutly, carefully shunning the sandbars and cleaving the ranks of the birds, which took wing, rowed, and talked of their hetman. St. John's Eve. A story told by the sacristan of the Dikanka church. Toma Grigorovich had one very strange eccentricity. To the day of his death, he never liked to tell the same thing twice. There were times when, if you asked him to relate a thing afresh, he would interpolate new matter or alter it so that it was impossible to recognize it. Once upon a time, one of those gentlemen who, like the usurers at our yearly fairs, clutch and beg and steal every sort of frippery, and issue mean little volumes, no thicker than an ABC book, every month or even every week, wormed this same story out of Toma Grigorovich, and the latter completely forgot about it. But that same young gentleman in the pea-green kaftan came from Poltava, bringing with him a little book, and opening it in the middle, showed it to us. Toma Grigorovich was on the point of setting his spectacles astride of his nose, but recollected that he had forgotten to wind thread about them and stick them together with wax, so he passed it over to me. As I understand nothing about reading and writing, and do not wear spectacles, I undertook to read it. I had not turned 2 leaves when all at once he caught me by the hand and stopped me. "Stop! Tell me first what you are reading." I confess that I was a trifle stunned by such a question. "What? What am I reading, Toma Grigorovich?" "Why, your own words." "Who told you that they were my words?" "Why, what more would you have? Here it is printed, related by such and such a sacristan." "Spit on the head of the man who printed that. He lies, the dog of a Moscow peddler. Did I say that? 'Twas just the same as though one hadn't his wits about him. Listen, I'll tell the tale to you on the spot." We moved up to the table, and he began. "My grandfather, the kingdom of heaven be his, may he eat only wheaten rolls and poppy seed cakes with honey in the other world, could tell a story wonderfully well. When he used to begin a tale, you could not stir from the spot all day, but kept on listening. He was not like the storyteller of the present day, when he begins to lie, with a tongue as though he had had nothing to eat for 3 days, so that you snatch your cap and flee from the house. I remember my old mother was alive then, and in the long winter evenings when the frost was crackling out of doors and had sealed up hermetically the narrow panes of our cottage, she used to sit at her wheel, drawing out a long thread in her hand, rocking the cradle with her foot, and humming a song, which I seem to hear even now. The lamp, quivering and flaring up as though in fear of something, lighted up our cottage. The spindle hummed, and all of us children, collected in a cluster, listened to grandfather, who had not crawled off the stove for more than 5 years, owing to his great age. But the wondrous tales of the incursions of the Zaporozhian Cossacks and the Poles, the bold deeds of Podkova, of Poltar Kojuk, and Sagaidachny did not interest us so much as the stories about some deed of old which always sent a shiver through our frames and made our hair rise upright on our heads. Sometimes such terror took possession of us in consequence of them, that, from that evening forward, heaven knows how wonderful everything seemed to us. If one chanced to go out of the cottage after nightfall for anything, one fancied that a visitor from the other world had lain down to sleep in one's bed, and I have often taken my own smock at a distance as it lay at the head of the bed, for the evil one rolled up into a ball. But the chief thing about grandfather's stories was that he never lied in all his life, and whatever he said was so, was so. I will now tell you one of his wonderful tales. I know that there are a great many wise people who copy in the courts and can even read civil documents, but who, if you were to put into their hand a simple prayer book, could not make out the first letter in it and would show all their teeth in derision. These people laugh at everything you tell them. Along comes one of them and doesn't believe in witches. Yes, glory to God that I have lived so long in the world. I have seen heretics to whom it would be easier to lie in confession than it would be to our brothers, and equals to take snuff, and these folk would deny the existence of witches. But let them just dream about something, and they won't even tell what it was. There, it is no use talking about them. No one could have recognized the village of ours a little over 100 years ago. It was a hamlet, the poorest kind of a hamlet. Half a score of miserable farmhouses, unplastered and badly thatched, were scattered here and there about the fields. There was not a yard or a decent shed to shelter animals or wagons. That was the way the wealthy lived, and if you had looked for our brothers, the poor, why, a hole in the ground, that was a cabin for you. Only by the smoke could you tell that a God-created man lived there. You ask why they lived so? It was not entirely through poverty. Almost everyone led a raiding Cossack life and gathered not a little plunder in foreign lands. It was rather because it was little use building up a good wooden house. Many folk were engaged in raids all over the country, Crimeans, Poles, Lithuanians. It was quite possible that their own countrymen might make a descent and plunder everything. Anything was possible. In this hamlet, a man, or rather a devil in human form, often made his appearance. Why he came, and whence, no one knew. He prowled about, got drunk, and suddenly disappeared as if into the air, leaving no trace of his existence. Then, behold, he seemed to have dropped from the sky again, and went flying about the street of the village, of which no trace now remains, and which was not more than 100 paces from Dikanka. He would collect together all the Cossacks he met. Then there were songs, laughter, and cash in plenty, and vodka flowed like water. He would address the pretty girls and give them ribbons, earrings, strings of beads, more than they knew what to do with. It is true that the pretty girls rather hesitated about accepting his presents. God knows, perhaps, what unclean hands they had passed through. My grandfather's aunt, who kept at that time a tavern in which Basavriuk, as they called this devil-man, often caroused, said that no consideration on the earth would have induced her to accept a gift from him. But then, again, how to avoid accepting? Fear seized on everyone when he knit his shaggy brows, and gave a sidelong glance which might send your feet God knows whither, whilst if you did accept, then the next night some fiend from the swamp, with horns on his head, came and began to squeeze your neck if there was a string of beads upon it, or bite your finger if there was a ring upon it, or drag you by the hair if ribbons were braided in it. God have mercy, then, on those who held such gifts. But here was the difficulty. It was impossible to get rid of them. If you threw them into the water, the diabolical ring or necklace would skim along the surface and into your hand. There was a church in the village, Saint Pantelei, if I remember rightly. There lived there a priest, Father Athanasii of blessed memory. Observing that Basavriuk did not come to church even at Easter, he determined to reprove him and impose penance upon him. Well, he hardly escaped with his life. "Hark ye, sir," he thundered in reply. "Learn to mind your own business instead of meddling in other people's if you don't want that throat of yours stuck with boiling kutia. 1. What was to be done with this unrepentant man? Father Athanasi contented himself with announcing that anyone who should make the acquaintance of Basavriuk would be counted a Catholic, an enemy of Christ's Orthodox Church, not a member of the human race. A. A dish of rice or wheat flour with honey and raisins, which is brought to the church on the celebration of memorial masses. In this village there was a Cossack named Korj, who had a labourer whom people called Peter the Orphan, perhaps because no one remembered either his father or mother. The church elder, it is true, said that they had died of the pest in his second year, but my grandfather's aunt would not hear of that, and tried with all her might to furnish him with parents, although poor Peter needed them about as much as we need last year's snow. She said that his father had been in Zaporozhye and had been taken prisoner by the Turks, amongst whom he underwent God only knows what tortures, until having, by some miracle, disguised himself as a eunuch, he made his escape. Little cared the black-browed youths and maidens about Peter's parents. They merely remarked that if he only had a new coat, a red sash, a black lambskin cap with a smart blue crown on his head, a Turkish sabre by his side, a whip in one hand, and a pipe with handsome mountings in the other, he would surpass all the young men. But the pity was that the only thing poor Peter had was a grey gabardine with more holes in it than there are gold pieces in a Jew's pocket. But that was not the worst of it. Korj had a daughter, such a beauty as I think you can hardly have chanced to see. My grandfather's aunt used to say, and you know that it is easier for a woman to kiss the evil one than to call anyone else a beauty, that this Cossack maiden's cheeks were as plump and fresh as the pinkest poppy when, bathed in God's dew, it unfolds its petals and coquets with the rising sun, that her brows were evenly arched over her bright eyes like black cords, such as our maidens buy nowadays, for their crosses and ducats off the Moscow peddlers who visit the villages with their baskets, that her little mouth, at sight of which the youths smack their lips, seemed made to warble the songs of nightingales, that her hair, black as the raven's wing, and soft as young flax, fell in curls over her shoulders, for our maidens did not then plait their hair in pigtails interwoven with pretty, bright-hued ribbons. Eh, may I never intone another Alleluia in the choir if I would not have kissed her, in spite of the grey which is making its way through the old wool which covers my pate, and of the old woman beside me like a thorn in my side. Well, you know what happens when young men and maidens live side by side. In the twilight, the heels of red boots were always visible in the place where Pidorka chatted with her Peter. But Cords would never have suspected anything out of the way. Only one day, it is evident that none but the evil one could have inspired him, Peter took into his head to kiss the maiden's rosy lips with all his heart, without first looking well about him. And that same evil one, may the son of a dog dream of the Holy Cross, caused the old greybeard, like a fool, to open the cottage door at that same moment. Cors was petrified, dropped his jaw, and clutched at the door for support. Those unlucky kisses completely stunned him. Recovering himself, he took his grandfather's hunting whip from the wall and was about to belabor Peter's back with it when Pidorka's little 6-year-old brother Ivas rushed up from somewhere or other and, grasping his father's legs with his little hands, screamed out, "Daddy, Daddy, don't beat Peter!" What was to be done? A father's heart is not made of stone. Hanging the whip again on the wall, he led Peter quietly from the house. "If you ever show yourself in my cottage again, or even under the windows, look out, Peter, for by heaven your black moustache will disappear, and your black locks, though wound twice about your ears, will take leave of your pate, or my name is not Terenti Korj." So saying, he gave him such a taste of his fist in the nape of his neck that all grew dark before Peter, and he flew headlong out of the place. So there was an end of their kissing. Sorrow fell upon our turtle doves, and a rumour grew rife in the village that a certain Pole, all embroidered with gold, with moustaches, sabre, spurs, and pockets jingling like the bells of the bag with which our sacristan Tarass goes through the church every day, had begun to frequent Corge's house. Now it is well known why a father has visitors when there is a black-browed daughter about. So, one day, Pidorka burst into tears and caught the hand of her brother Ivas. "Ivas, my dear, Ivas, my love, fly to Peter, my child of gold, like an arrow from a bow. Tell him all. I would have loved his brown eyes. I would have kissed his fair face, but my fate decrees otherwise. More than one handkerchief have I wet with burning tears. I am sad and heavy at heart, and my own father is my enemy. I will not marry the Pole, whom I do not love. Tell him they are making ready for a wedding, but there will be no music at our wedding. Priests will sing instead of pipes and viols. I shall not dance with my bridegroom, they will carry me out. Dark, dark will be my dwelling of maple wood, and instead of chimneys, a cross will stand upon the roof." Peter stood petrified, without moving from the spot, when the innocent child lisped out Pidorka's words to him. "And I, wretched man, had thought to go to the Crimea and Turkey, to win gold and return to thee, my beauty. But it may not be. We have been overlooked by the evil eye. I too shall have a wedding, dear one, but no ecclesiastics will be present at that wedding. The black crow instead of the Pope will caw over me. The bare plain will be my dwelling, the dark blue cloud my roof tree. The eagle will claw out my brown eyes. The rain will wash my Cossack bones, and the whirlwinds dry them. But what am I? Of what should I complain? 'Tis clear God willed it so. If I am to be lost, then so be it." And he went straight to the tavern. My late grandfather's aunt was somewhat surprised at seeing Peter at the tavern at an hour when good men go to morning mass, and stared at him as though in a dream when he called for a jug of brandy, about half a pailful. But the poor fellow tried in vain to drown his woe. The vodka stung his tongue like nettles and tasted more bitter than wormwood. He flung the jug from him upon the ground. "You have sorrowed enough, Cossack," growled a bass voice behind him. He looked round. It was Basavriuk. Ugh, what a face! His hair was like a brush, his eyes like those of a bull. "I know what you lack. Here it is." As he spoke, he jingled a leather purse which hung from his girdle and smiled diabolically. Peter shuddered. "Ha, ha, ha! How it shines!" he roared, shaking out ducats into his hands. "Ha, ha, ha! How it jingles! And I only ask one thing for a whole pile of such shiners." "It is the evil one," exclaimed Peter. "Give me them. I'm ready for anything." They struck hands upon it, and Basavriuk said, "You are just in time, Peter. Tomorrow is St. John the Baptist's day. Only on this one night in the year does the fern blossom. I will await you at midnight in the Bear's Ravine. I do not believe that chickens await the hour when the housewife brings their corn with as much anxiety as Peter awaited the evening. He kept looking to see whether the shadows of the trees were not lengthening, whether the sun was not turning red towards setting. And the longer he watched, the more impatient he grew. How long it was! Evidently, God's day had lost its end somewhere. But now the sun has set. The sky is red only on one side, and it is already growing dark. It grows colder in the fields. It gets gloomier, and at last, quite dark. At last. With heart almost bursting from his bosom, he set out and cautiously made his way down through the thick woods into the deep hollow called the Bear's Ravine. Basavriuk was already waiting there. It was so dark that you could not see a yard before you. Hand in hand they entered the ravine, pushing through the luxuriant thorn bushes and stumbling at almost every step. At last they reached an open spot. Peter looked about him. He had never chanced to come there before. Here Basavriuk halted. "Do you see before you 3 hillocks? There are a great many kinds of flowers upon them. May some power keep you from plucking even one of them, but as soon as the fern blossoms, seize it, and look not round, no matter what may seem to be going on behind thee." Peter wanted to ask some questions, but behold, Basavriuk was no longer there. He approached the 3 hillocks. Where were the flowers? He saw none. The wild steppe grass grew all around, and hid everything in its luxuriance. But the lightning flashed, and before him was a whole bed of flowers, all wonderful, all strange, whilst amongst them there were also the simple fronds of fern. Peter doubted his senses and stood thoughtfully before them, arms akimbo. What manner of prodigy is this? Why, one can see these weeds 10 times a day. What is there marvellous about them? Devil's face must be mocking me. But behold, the tiny flower bud of the fern reddened and moved as though alive. It was a marvel in truth. It grew larger and larger, and glowed like a burning coal. The tiny stars of light flashed up, something burst softly, and the flower opened before his eyes like a flame, lighting the others about it. Now is the time, thought Peter, and extended his hand. He saw hundreds of hairy hands reach also for the flower from behind him, and there was a sound of scampering in his rear. He half closed his eyes and plucked sharply at the stalk, and the flower remained in his hand. All became still. Upon a stump sat Basavriuk, quite blue like a corpse. He did not move so much as a finger. High eyes were immovably fixed on something visible to him alone. His mouth was half open and speechless. Nothing stirred around. Ugh! It was horrible. But then a whistle was heard, which made Peter's heart grow cold within him, and it seemed to him that the grass whispered, and the flowers began to talk among themselves in delicate voices, like little silver bells, while the trees rustled in murmuring contention. Basavriuk's face suddenly became full of life, and his eyes sparkled. "The witch has just returned," he muttered between his teeth. "Hearken, Peter. A charmer will stand before you in a moment. Do whatever she commands. If not, you are lost forever." Then he parted the thorn bushes with a knotty stick, and before him stood a tiny farmhouse. Basavriuk smote it with his fist, and the wall trembled. A large black dog ran out to meet them, and with a whine transformed itself into a cat and flew straight at his eyes. Don't be angry, you old Satan," said Basavriuk, employing such words as would have made a good man stop his ears. Behold, instead of a cat, an old woman all bent into a bow, with a face wrinkled like a baked apple, and a nose and chin like a pair of nutcrackers. A fine charmer, thought Peter, and cold chills ran down his back. The witch tore the flower from his hand, stooped and muttered over it for a long time, sprinkling it with some kind of water. Sparks flew from her mouth, and foam appeared on her lips. "Throw it away," she said, giving it back to Peter. Peter threw it, but what wonder was this? The flower did not fall straight to the earth, but for a long while twinkled like a fiery ball through the darkness and swam through the air like a boat. At last it began to sink lower and lower, and fell so far away that the little star, hardly larger than a poppy seed, was barely visible. "There," croaked the old woman in a dull voice, and Basavriuk, giving him a spade, said, "Dig here, Peter. You will find more gold than you or Cors ever dreamed of." Peter spat on his hands, seized the spade, pressed his foot on it, and turned up the earth, a second, a third, a fourth time. The spade clinked against something hard and would go no further. Then his eyes began to distinguish a small, iron-bound coffer. He tried to seize it, but the chest began to sink into the earth, deeper, farther, and deeper still, whilst behind him he heard a laugh like a serpent's hiss. "No, you shall not have the gold until you shed human blood," said the witch, and she led up to him a child of 6, covered with a white sheet and indicated by a sign that he was to cut off his head. Peter was stunned. A trifle indeed to cut off a man's, or even an innocent child's, head for no reason whatever. In wrath he tore off the sheet enveloping the victim's head, and behold, before him stood Ivas. The poor child crossed his little hands and hung his head. Peter flew at the witch with the knife like a madman, and was on the point of laying hands on her. "What did you promise for the girl?" thundered Basavriuk, and like a shot he was on his back. The witch stamped her foot. A blue flame flashed from the earth and illumined all within it. The earth became transparent, as if moulded of crystal, and all that was within it became visible, as if in the palm of the hand. Ducats, precious stones in chests and pots, were piled in heaps beneath the very spot they stood on. Peter's eyes flashed, his mind grew troubled. He grasped the knife like a madman, and the innocent blood spurted into his eyes. Diabolical laughter resounded on all sides. Misshapen monsters flew past him in flocks. The witch, fastening her hands in the headless trunk like a wolf, drank its blood. His head whirled. Collecting all his strength, he set out to run. Everything grew red before him. The trees seemed steeped in blood and burned and groaned. The sky glowed and threatened. Burning points, like lightning, flickered before his eyes. Utterly exhausted, he rushed into his miserable hovel and fell to the ground like a log. A death-like sleep overpowered him. 2 days and 2 nights did Peter sleep, without once awakening. When he came to himself, on the 3rd day, he looked long at all the corners of his hut, but in vain did he endeavour to recollect what had taken place. His memory was like a miser's pocket, from which you cannot entice a quarter of a kopeck. Stretching himself, he heard something clash at his feet. He looked. There were 2 bags of gold. Then only, as if in a dream, he recollected that he had been seeking for treasure, and that something had frightened him in the woods. Corge saw the sacks, and was mollified. "A fine fellow, Peter, quite unequalled. Yes, and did I not love him? Was he not to me as my own son?" And the old fellow repeated this fiction until he wept over it himself. Pidorka began to tell Peter how some passing gypsies had stolen Ivas, but he could not even recall him. To such a degree had the devil's influence darkened his mind. There was no reason for delay. The Pole was dismissed, and the wedding feast prepared. Rolls were baked, towels and handkerchiefs embroidered. The young people were seated at table. The wedding loaf was cut. Guitars, cymbals, pipes, viols sounded, and pleasure was rife. A wedding in the olden times was not like one of the present day. My grandfather's aunt used to tell how the maidens, in festive headdresses of yellow, blue, and pink ribbons, above which they bound gold braid, in thin chemisettes embroidered on all the seams with red silk and strewn with tiny silver flowers, in Morocco shoes with high iron heels, danced the Gorlitza as swimmingly as peacocks and as wildly as the whirlwind. How the youths, with their ship-shaped caps upon their heads, the crowns of gold brocade, and 2 horns projecting, one in front and another behind, of the very finest black lambskin, in tunics of the finest blue silk with red borders, stepped forward one by one, their arms akimbo in stately form, and executed the gopak. How the lads, in tall Cossack caps and light cloth gabardines, girt with silver-embroidered belts, their short pipes in their teeth, skipped before them and talked nonsense. Even Corge, as he gazed at the young people, could not help getting gay in his old age. Guitar in hand, alternately puffing at his pipe and singing, a brandy glass upon his head, the greybeard began the national dance amid loud shouts from the merrymakers. What will not people devise in merry mood? They even began to disguise their faces till they did not look like human beings. On such occasions one would dress himself as a Jew, another as the devil. They would begin by kissing each other, and end by seizing each other by the hair. God be with them. You laughed till you held your sides. They dressed themselves in Turkish and Tatar garments. All upon them glowed like a conflagration, and then they began to joke and play pranks. An amusing thing happened to my grandfather's aunt, who was at this wedding. She was wearing an ample Tatar robe and, wine-glass in hand, was entertaining the company. The evil one instigated one man to pour vodka over her from behind. Another, at the same moment, evidently not by accident, struck a light and held it to her. The flame flashed up, and poor aunt, in terror, flung her dress off before them all. Screams, laughter, jests arose as if at a fair. In a word, the old folks could not recall so merry a wedding. Pidorka and Peter began to live like a gentleman and lady. There was plenty of everything, and everything was fine. But honest folk shook their heads when they marked their way of living. From the devil no good can come, they unanimously agreed. Whence, except from the tempter of orthodox people, came this wealth? Where else could he have got such a lot of gold from? Why, On the very day that he got rich, did Basavriuk vanish as if into thin air. Say, if you can, that people only imagine things. A month had not passed, and no one would have recognized Peter. He sat in one spot, saying no word to anyone, but continually thinking and seemingly trying to recall something. When Pidorka succeeded in getting him to speak, he appeared to forget himself and would carry on a conversation and even grow cheerful. But if he inadvertently glanced at the sacks, "Stop! Stop! I have forgotten," he would cry, and again plunge into reverie and strive to recall something. Sometimes, when he sat still a long time in one place, it seemed to him as though it were coming, just coming back to mind, but again all would fade away. It seemed as if he was sitting in the tavern. They brought him vodka. Vodka stung him. Vodka was repulsive to him. Someone came along and struck him on the shoulder, but beyond that, everything was veiled in darkness before him. The perspiration would stream down his face, and he would sit exhausted in the same place. What did not Pidorka do? She consulted the sorceresses, and they poured out fear and brewed stomachache, too, but all to no avail. And so the summer passed. Many a Cossack had mowed and reaped. Many a Cossack, more enterprising than the rest, had set off upon an expedition. Flocks of ducks were already crowding the marshes, but there was not even a hint of improvement. 2. To pour out fear refers to a practice resorted to in case of fear. When it is desired to know what caused this, melted lead or wax is poured into water, and the object whose form it assumes is the one which frightened the sick person. After this, the fear departs. Sonia Schnitzer is brewed for giddiness and pain in the bowels. To this end, a bit of stump is burned, thrown into a jug, and turned upside down into a bowl filled with water, which is placed on the patient's stomach. After an incantation, he is given a spoonful of this water to drink. It was read upon the steps. Ricks of grain, like Cossacks' caps, dotted the fields here and there. On the highway were to be encountered wagons loaded with brushwood and logs. The ground had become more solid, and in places was touched with frost. Already had the snow begun to fall, and the branches of the trees were covered with rime like rabbit skin. Already on frosty days the robin redbreast hopped about on the snow heaps like a foppish Polish nobleman and picked out grains of corn, and children with huge sticks played hockey upon the ice, while their fathers lay quietly on the stove, issuing forth at intervals with lighted pipes in their lips to growl in regular fashion at the orthodox frost, or to take the air and thresh the grains spread out in the barn. At last the snow began to melt, and the ice slipped away, but Peter remained the same, and the more time went on, the more morose he grew. He sat in the cottage as though nailed to the spot, with the sacks of gold at his feet. He grew averse to companionship, his hair grew long, he became terrible to look at. And still he thought of but one thing. Still he tried to recall something, and got angry and ill-tempered because he could not. Often, rising wildly from his seat, he gesticulated violently and fixed his eyes on something as though desirous of catching it, his lips moving as though desirous of uttering some long-forgotten word, but remaining speechless. Fury would take possession of him. He would gnaw and bite his hands like a man half crazy, and in his vexation would tear out his hair by the handful until, calming down, he would relapse into forgetfulness, as it were, and then would again strive to recall the past and be again seized with fury and fresh tortures. What visitation of God was this? Pidorka was neither dead nor alive. At first it was horrible for her to remain alone with him in the cottage, but in course of time the poor woman grew accustomed to her sorrow. But it was impossible to recognize the Pidorka of former days. No blushes, no smiles. She was thin and worn with grief, and had wept her bright eyes away. Once someone who took pity on her advised her to go to the witch who dwelt in the Bear's Ravine, and enjoyed the reputation of being able to cure every disease in the world. She determined to try that last remedy, and finally persuaded the old woman to come to her. This was on St. John's Eve, as it chanced. Peter lay insensible on the bench and did not observe the newcomer. Slowly he rose and looked about him. Suddenly he trembled in every limb as though he were on the scaffold. His hair rose upon his head, and he laughed a laugh that filled Pidorka's heart with fear. "I have remembered! Remembered!" he cried, in terrible joy, and swinging a hatchet round his head, he struck at the old woman with all his might. The hatchet penetrated the oaken door nearly 4 inches. The old woman disappeared, and a child of 7, covered in a white sheet, stood in the middle of the cottage. The sheet flew off. "Ivas!" cried Pidorka, and ran to him. But the apparition became covered from head to foot with blood and illumined the whole room with red light. She ran into the passage in her terror, but on recovering herself a little, wished to help Peter. In vain. The door had slammed to behind her so that she could not open it. People ran up and began to knock. They broke in the door, as though there were but one mind among them. The whole cottage was full of smoke, and just in the middle, where Peter had stood, was a heap of ashes whence smoke was still rising. They flung themselves upon the sacks. Only broken potsherds lay there instead of ducats. The Cossacks stood with staring eyes and open mouths, as if rooted to the earth, not daring to move a hair, such terror did this wonder inspire in them. I do not remember what happened next. Pidorka made a vow to go upon a pilgrimage, collected the property left her by her father, and in a few days it was as if she had never been in the village. Whither she had gone, no one could tell. Officious old women would have dispatched her to the same place whither Peter had gone. But a Cossack from Kiev reported that he had seen, in a cloister, a nun withered to a mere skeleton who prayed unceasingly. Her fellow villagers recognized her as Pidorka by the tokens, that no one heard her utter a word, and that she had come on foot and had brought a frame for the picture of God's mother, set with such brilliant stones that all were dazzled at the sight. But this was not the end, if you please. On the same day that the evil one made away with Peter, Basavriuk appeared again, but all fled from him. They knew what sort of a being he was, none else than Satan, who had assumed human form in order to unearth treasures, and since treasures do not yield to unclean hands, he seduced the young. That same year all deserted their earthen huts and collected in a village, but even there was no peace on account of that accursed Basavriuk. My late grandfather's aunt said that he was particularly angry with her because she had abandoned her former tavern and tried with all his might to revenge himself upon her. Once the village elders were assembled in the tavern and, as the saying goes, were arranging the precedence at the table, in the middle of which was placed a small roasted lamb, shame to say. They chattered about this, that, and the other, among the rest about various marvels and strange things. Well, they saw something. It would have been nothing if only one had seen it, but all saw it, and it was this. The sheep raised his head, his goggling eyes became alive and sparkled, and the black, bristling moustache, which appeared for one instant, made a significant gesture at those present. All at once recognized Basavriuk's countenance in the sheep's head. My grandfather's aunt thought it was on the point of asking for vodka. The worthy elders seized their hats and hastened home. Another time, the church elder himself, who was fond of an occasional private interview with my grandfather's brandy glass, had not succeeded in getting to the bottom twice, when he beheld the glass bowing very low to him. "Satan take you! Let us make the sign of the cross over you." And the same marvel happened to his better half. She had just begun to mix the dough in a huge kneading trough, when suddenly the trough sprang up. "Stop! Stop! Where are you going?" Putting its arms akimbo, with dignity, it went skipping all about the cottage. You may laugh, but it was no laughing matter to our grandfathers. And in vain did Father Athanasi go through all the village with holy water and chase the devil through all the streets with his brush. My late grandfather's aunt long complained that, as soon as it was dark, someone came knocking at her door and scratching at the wall. Well, all appears to be quiet now in the place where our village stands, but it was not so very long ago, my father was still alive, that I remember how a good man could not pass the ruined tavern which a dishonest race had long managed for their own interest. From the smoke-blackened chimneys, smoke poured out in a pillar, and rising high in the air, rolled off like a cap, scattering burning coals over the steppe. And Satan, the son of a dog should not be mentioned, sobbed so pitifully in his lair that the startled ravens rose in flocks from the neighboring oak wood and flew through the air with wild cries. The Cloak. In the department of, but it is better not to mention the department, there is nothing more irritable than departments, regiments, courts of justice, and, in a word, every branch of public service. Each individual attached to them nowadays thinks all society insulted in his person. Quite recently, a complaint was received from a justice of the peace, in which he plainly demonstrated that all the imperial institutions were going to the dogs and that the Tsar's sacred name was being taken in vain. And in proof he appended to the complaint a romance in which the justice of the peace is made to appear about once every 10 lines, and sometimes in a drunken condition. Therefore, in order to avoid all unpleasantness, it will be better to describe the department in question only as a certain department. So, in a certain department, there was a certain official, not a very high one, it must be allowed, short of stature, somewhat pockmarked, red-haired, and short-sighted, with a bald forehead, wrinkled cheeks, and a complexion of the kind known as sanguine. The St. Petersburg climate was responsible for this. As for his official status, he was what is called a perpetual titular councillor, over which, as is well known, some writers make merry and crack their jokes, obeying the praiseworthy custom of attacking those who cannot bite back. His family name was Bashmachkin. This name is evidently derived from bashmak, shoe, but when, at what time, and in what manner, is not known. His father and grandfather, and all the Bashmachkins, always wore boots, which only had new heels 2 or 3 times a year. His name was Akaki Akakievich. It may strike the reader as rather singular and far-fetched, but he may rest assured that it was by no means far-fetched, and that the circumstances were such that it would have been impossible to give him any other. This is how it came about. Akaki Akakievich was born, if my memory fails me not, in the evening of the 23rd of March. His mother, the wife of a government official and a very fine woman, made all due arrangements for having the child baptized. She was lying on the bed opposite the door. On her right stood the godfather, Ivan Ivanovich Eroshkin, a most estimable man, who served as presiding officer of the Senate, while the godmother, Anna Semenovna Bielobrushkova, the wife of an officer of the quarter and a woman of rare virtues. They offered the mother her choice of 3 names, Mokia, Sosia, or that the child should be called after the martyr Kozdazat. "No," said the good woman, "all those names are poor." In order to please her, they opened the calendar to another place. 3 more names appeared, Trifeli, Dula, and Varakasi. "This is a judgment," said the old woman. "What names? I truly never heard the like. Varada or Varuch might have been born, but not Trifeli and Varakasi." They turned to another page and found Pavsikaki and Vaktisi. "Now I see," said the old woman, "that it is plainly fate, and since such is the case, it will be better to name him after his father. His father's name was Akaki, so let his sons be Akaki too." In this manner he became Akaki Akakievich. They christened the child, whereat he wept and made a grimace, as though he foresaw that he was to be a titular councillor. In this manner did it all come about. We have mentioned it in order that the reader might see for himself that it was a case of necessity, and that it was utterly impossible to give him any other name. When and how he entered the department, and who appointed him, no one could remember. However much the directors and chiefs of all kinds were changed, he was always to be seen in the same place, the same attitude, the same occupation, so that it was afterwards affirmed that he had been born in undress uniform with a bald head. No respect was shown him in the department. The porter not only did not rise from his seat when he passed, but never even glanced at him, any more than if a fly had flown through the reception room. His superiors treated him in coolly despotic fashion. Some sub-chief would thrust a paper under his nose without so much as saying, "Copy," or "Here's a nice interesting affair," or anything else agreeable, as is customary amongst well-bred officials. And he took it, looking only at the paper and not observing who handed it to him, or whether he had the right to do so. simply took it and set about copying it. The young officials laughed at and made fun of him, so far as their official wit permitted, told in his presence various stories concocted about him and about his landlady, an old woman of 70, declared that she beat him, asked when the wedding was to be, and strewed bits of paper over his head, calling them snow. But Akaki Akakievich answered not a word, any more than if there had been no one there besides himself. It even had no effect upon his work. Amid all these annoyances, he never made a single mistake in a letter. But if the joking became wholly unbearable, as when they jogged his hand and prevented his attending to his work, he would exclaim, "Leave me alone. Why do you insult me?" And there was something strange in the words and the voice in which they were uttered. There was in it something which moved to pity, so much that one young man, a newcomer, who, taking pattern by the others, had permitted himself to make sport of Akaki, suddenly stopped short, as though all about him had undergone a transformation and presented itself in a different aspect. Some unseen force repelled him from the comrades whose acquaintance he had made, on the supposition that they were well-bred and polite men. Long afterwards, in his gayest moments, there recurred to his mind the little official with the bald forehead, with his heart-rending words, "Leave me alone. Why do you insult me?" In these moving words, other words resounded, "I am thy brother." And the young man covered his face with his hand, and many a time afterwards, in the course of his life, shuddered at seeing how much inhumanity there is in man, how much savage coarseness is concealed beneath delicate, refined worldliness, and even, O God, in that man whom the world acknowledges as honorable and noble. It would be difficult to find another man who lived so entirely for his duties. It is not enough to say that Akaki labored with zeal. No, he labored with love. In his copying, he found a varied and agreeable employment. Enjoyment was written on his face. Some letters were even favorites with him, and when he encountered these, he smiled, winked, and worked with his lips, till it seemed as though each letter might be read in his face as his pen traced it. If his pay had been in proportion to his zeal, he would, perhaps, to his great surprise, have been made even a councillor of state. But he worked, as his companions, the wits, put it, like a horse in a mill. Moreover, it is impossible to say that no attention was paid to him. One director, being a kindly man, and desirous of rewarding him for his long service, ordered him to be given something more important than mere copying, so he was ordered to make a report of an already concluded affair to another department, the duty consisting simply in changing the heading and altering a few words from the first to the third person. This caused him so much toil that he broke into a perspiration, rubbed his forehead, and finally said, "No, give me rather something to copy." After that, they let him copy on forever. Outside this copying, it appeared that nothing existed for him. He gave no thought to his clothes. His undress uniform was not green, but a sort of rusty meal color. The collar was low, so that his neck, in spite of the fact that it was not long, seemed inordinately so as it emerged from it, like the necks of those plaster cats which wag their heads and are carried about upon the heads of scores of image sellers. And something was always sticking to his uniform, either a bit of hay or some trifle. Moreover, he had a peculiar knack, as he walked along the street, of arriving beneath a window just as all sorts of rubbish were being flung out of it. Hence he always bore about on his hat scraps of melon rinds and other such articles. Never once in his life did he give heed to what was going on every day in the street, while it is well known that his young brother officials train the range of their glances till they can see when anyone's trouser straps come undone upon the opposite sidewalk, which always brings a malicious smile to their faces. But Akaki Akakievich saw in all things the clean, even strokes of his written lines, and only when a horse thrust his nose from some unknown quarter over his shoulder and sent a whole gust of wind down his neck from his nostrils did he observe that he was not in the middle of a page, but in the middle of the street. On reaching home, he sat down at once at the table, supped his cabbage soup up quickly, and swallowed a bit of beef with onions, never noticing their taste, and gulping down everything with flies, and anything else which the Lord happened to send at the moment. His stomach filled, he rose from the table, and copied papers which he had brought home. If there happened to be none, he took copies for himself, for his own gratification, especially if the document was noteworthy, not on account of its style, but of its being addressed to some distinguished person. Even at the hour when the grey St. Petersburg sky had quite dispersed, and all the official world had eaten or dined, each as he could, in accordance with the salary he received and his own fancy. When all were resting from the departmental jar of pens, running to and fro from their own and other people's indispensable occupations, and from all the work that an uneasy man makes willingly for himself rather than what is necessary, when officials hasten to dedicate to pleasure the time which is left to them, one bolder than the rest going to the theatre, another into the street looking under all the bonnets, another wasting his evening in compliments to some pretty girl, the star of a small official circle, another, and this is the common case of all, visiting his comrades on the fourth or third floor, in two small rooms with an anteroom or kitchen, and some pretensions to fashion, such as a lamp or some other trifle, which has cost many a sacrifice of dinner or pleasure trip. In a word, at the hour when all officials disperse among the contracted quarters of their friends to play whist, as they sip their tea from glasses with a kopek's worth of sugar, smoke long pipes, relate at times some bits of gossip which a Russian man can never, under any circumstances, refrain from, and, when there is nothing else to talk of, repeat eternal anecdotes about the commandant to whom they had sent word that the tails of the horses on the Falconet monument had been cut off, when all strive to divert themselves, Akaky Akakievitch indulged in no kind of diversion. No one could ever say that he had seen him at any kind of evening party. Having written to his heart's content, he lay down to sleep, smiling at the thought of the coming day, of what God might send him to copy on the morrow. Thus flowed on the peaceful life of the man who, with a salary of 400 roubles, understood how to be content with his lot. And thus it would have continued to flow on, perhaps to extreme old age, were it not that there are various ills strewn along the path of life for titular councillors, as well as for private, actual, court, and every other species of councillor, even for those who never give any advice or take any themselves. There exists in St. Petersburg a powerful foe of all who receive a salary of 400 roubles a year or thereabouts. This foe is no other than the northern cold, although it is said to be very healthy. At 9 o'clock in the morning, at the very hour when the streets are filled with men bound for the various official departments, it begins to bestow such powerful and piercing nips on all noses impartially that the poor officials really do not know what to do with them. At an hour when the foreheads of even those who occupy exalted positions ache with the cold and tears start to their eyes, the poor titular councillors are sometimes quite unprotected. Their only salvation lies in traversing as quickly as possible, in their thin little cloaks, 5 or 6 streets, and then warming their feet in the porter's room, and so thawing all their talents and qualifications for official service, which had become frozen on the way. Akaky Akakievitch had felt for some time that his back and shoulders suffered with peculiar poignancy, in spite of the fact that he tried to traverse the distance with all possible speed. He began finally to wonder whether the fault did not lie in his cloak. He examined it thoroughly at home and discovered that in 2 places, namely on the back and shoulders, it had become thin as gauze. The cloth was worn to such a degree that he could see through it, and the lining had fallen into pieces. You must know that Akaky Akakievitch's cloak served as an object of ridicule to the officials. They even refused it the noble name of cloak and called it a cape. In fact, it was of singular make, its collar diminishing year by year, but serving to patch its other parts. The patching did not exhibit great skill on the part of the tailor, and was, in fact, baggy and ugly. Seeing how the matter stood, Akaky Akakievitch decided that it would be necessary to take the cloak to Petrovitch, the tailor, who lived somewhere on the 4th floor up a dark staircase, and who, in spite of his having but one eye and pockmarks all over his face, busied himself with considerable success in repairing the trousers and coats of officials and others. That is to say, when he was sober and not nursing some other scheme in his head. It is not necessary to say much about this tailor, but as it is the custom to have the character of each personage in a novel clearly defined, there is no help for it. So here is Petrovich the tailor. At first he was called only Grigory, and was some gentleman's serf. He commenced calling himself Petrovich from the time when he received his free papers, and further began to drink heavily on all holidays, at first on the great ones, and then on all church festivities without discrimination, wherever a cross stood in the calendar. On this point he was faithful to ancestral custom, and when quarrelling with his wife, he called her a low female and a German. As we have mentioned his wife, it will be necessary to say a word or two about her. Unfortunately, little is known of her beyond the fact that Petrovich has a wife who wears a cap and a dress, but cannot lay claim to beauty. At least, no one but the soldiers of the guard even looked under her cap when they met her. Ascending the staircase which led to Petrovich's room, which staircase was all soaked with dishwater and reeked with the smell of spirits which affects the eyes and is an inevitable adjunct to all dark stairways in St. Petersburg houses, ascending the stairs, Akaky Akakievich pondered how much Petrovich would ask and mentally resolved not to give more than 2 rubles. The door was open, for the mistress, in cooking some fish, had raised such a smoke in the kitchen that not even the beetles were visible. Akaky Akakievich passed through the kitchen unperceived, even by the housewife, and at length reached a room where he beheld Petrovich seated on a large unpainted table, with his legs tucked under him like a Turkish pasha. His feet were bare, after the fashion of tailors who sit at work, and the first thing which caught the eye was his thumb, with a deformed nail thick and strong as a turtle's shell. About Petrovich's neck hung a skein of silk and thread, and upon his knees lay some old garment. He had been trying unsuccessfully for 3 minutes to thread his needle, and was enraged at the darkness, and even at the thread, growling in a low voice, "It won't go through, the barbarian. You pricked me, you rascal." Akaky Akakievich was vexed at arriving at the precise moment when Petrovich was angry. He liked to order something of Petrovich when the latter was a little downhearted, or, as his wife expressed it, when he had settled himself with brandy, the one-eyed devil. Under such circumstances, Petrovich generally came down in his price very readily, and even bowed and returned thanks. Afterwards, to be sure, his wife would come, complaining that her husband was drunk and so had fixed the price too low. But if only a 10-kopeck piece were added, then the matter was settled. But now it appeared that Petrovich was in a sober condition, and therefore rough, taciturn, and inclined to demand, Satan only knows what price. Akaky Akakievich felt this, and would gladly have beat a retreat, but he was in for it. Petrovich screwed up his one eye very intently at him, and Akaky Akakievich involuntarily said, "How do you do, Petrovich?" "I wish you a good morning, sir," said Petrovich, squinting at Akaky Akakievich's hands to see what sort of booty he had brought. "Ah, aye. To you, Petrovich, this—" It must be known that Akaky Akakievich expressed himself chiefly by prepositions, adverbs, and scraps of phrases which had no meaning whatever. If the matter was a very difficult one, he had a habit of never completing his sentences, so that frequently, having begun a phrase with the words, "This, in fact, is quite—" he forgot to go on, thinking that he had already finished it. "What is it?" asked Petrovich, and with his one eye scanned Akakievich's whole uniform from the collar down to the cuffs, the back, the tails, and the buttonholes, all of which were well known to him, since they were his own handiwork. Such is the habit of tailors, it is the first thing they do on meeting one. "But here, this, Petrovich, a cloak, cloth. Here you see, everywhere, in different places, it is quite strong. It is a little dusty, and looks old, but it is new, only here in one place it is a little. On the back, and here on one of the shoulders, it is a little worn, yes. Here on this shoulder it is a little. Do you see? That is all. And a little work." Petrovich took the cloak, spread it out, to begin with, on the table, looked hard at it, shook his head, reached out his hand to the window-sill for his snuff-box, adorned with the portrait of some general, though what general is unknown, for the place where the face should have been had been rubbed through by the finger, and a square bit of paper had been pasted over it. Having taken a pinch of snuff, Petrovich held up the cloak and inspected it against the light, and again shook his head once more. After which he again lifted the general adorned lid with its bit of pasted paper, and having stuffed his nose with snuff, closed and put away the snuff-box, and said finally, "No, it is impossible to mend it. It's a wretched garment." Akakievich's heart sank at these words. "Why is it impossible, Petrovich?" he said, almost in the pleading voice of a child. "All that ails it is that it is worn on the shoulders. You must have some pieces." "Yes, patches could be found. Patches are easily found," said Petrovich. "But there's nothing to sew them to. The thing is completely rotten. If you put a needle to it, see, it will give way. Let it give way, and you can put on another patch at once. But there is nothing to put the patches onto. There's no use in strengthening it. It is too far gone. It's lucky that it's cloth, for if the wind were to blow, it would fly away." "Well, strengthen it again. How will this, in fact—" "No," said Petrovich decisively. "There is nothing to be done with it. It's a thoroughly bad job. You'd better, when the cold winter weather comes on, make yourself some gaiters out of it, because stockings are not warm. The Germans invented them in order to make more money." Petrovich loved, on all occasions, to have a fling at the Germans. "But it is plain you must have a new cloak." At the word new, all grew dark before Akakie Akakievich's eyes, and everything in the room began to whirl round. The only thing he saw clearly was the general with the paper face on the lid of Petrovich's snuff-box. "A new one?" said he, as if still in a dream. "Why, I have no money for that." "Yes, a new one," said Petrovich, with barbarous composure. "Well, if it came to a new one, how would it— You mean, how much would it cost?" "Yes." "Well, you would have to lay out 150 or more," said Petrovich, and pursed up his lips significantly. He liked to produce powerful effects, liked to stun utterly and suddenly, and then to glance sideways to see what face the stunned person would put on the matter. 150 rubles for a cloak," shrieked poor Akakie Akakievich, perhaps for the first time in his life, for his voice had always been distinguished for softness. "Yes, sir," said Petrovich, "for any kind of cloak. If you have a marten fur on the collar or a silk-lined hood, it will mount up to 200. "Petrovich, please," said Akakie Akakievich in a beseeching tone, not hearing and not trying to hear Petrovich's words and disregarding all his effects. "Some repairs in order that it may wear yet a little longer." "No, it would only be a waste of time and money," said Petrovich, and Akakie Akakievich went away after these words, utterly discouraged. But Petrovich stood for some time after his departure, with significantly compressed lips and without betaking himself to his work, satisfied that he would not be dropped and an artistic tailor employed. Akakie Akakievich went out into the street as if in a dream. "Such an affair," he said to himself. "I did not think it had come to—" And then after a pause, he added, "Well, so it is. See what it has come to at last. And I never imagined that it was so." Then followed a long silence, after which he exclaimed, "Well, so it is. See what already, nothing unexpected, that it would be nothing. What a strange circumstance." So saying, instead of going home, he went in exactly the opposite direction without himself suspecting it. On the way, a chimney-sweep bumped up against him and blackened his shoulder, and a whole hatful of rubbish landed on him from the top of a house which was building. He did not notice it, and only when he ran against a watchman, who, having planted his halberd beside him, was shaking some snuff from his box into his horny hand, did he recover himself a little, and that because the watchman said, "Why are you poking yourself into a man's very face? Haven't you the pavement?" This caused him to look about him and turn towards home. There only he finally began to collect his thoughts and to survey his position in its clear and actual light, and to argue with himself, sensibly and frankly, as with a reasonable friend with whom one can discuss private and personal matters. "No," said Akaki Akakievich. "It is impossible to reason with Petrovich now. He is that. Evidently his wife has been beating him. I'd better go to him on Sunday morning. After Saturday night, he will be a little cross-eyed and sleepy, for he will want to get drunk, and his wife won't give him any money. And at such a time, a 10-kopeck piece in his hand he will become more fit to reason with. And then the cloak, and that." Thus argued Akaki Akakievich with himself, regained his courage, and waited until the first Sunday, when, seeing from afar that Petrovich's wife had left the house, he went straight to him. Petrovich's eye was, indeed, very much askew after Saturday. His head drooped, and he was very sleepy. But for all that, as soon as he knew what it was a question of, it seemed as though Satan jogged his memory. "Impossible," said he. "Please to order a new one." Thereupon Akaki Akakievich handed over the 10-kopeck piece. "Thank you, sir. I will drink your good health," said Petrovich. "But as for the cloak, don't trouble yourself about it. It is good for nothing. I will make you a capital new one, so let us settle about it now." Akaki Akakievich was still for mending it, but Petrovich would not hear of it, and said, "I shall certainly have to make you a new one, and you may depend upon it that I shall do my best. It may even be, as the fashion goes, that the collar can be fastened by silver hooks under a flap." Then Akaki Akakievich saw that it was impossible to get along without a new cloak, and his spirits sank utterly. How, in fact, was it to be done? Where was the money to come from? He might, to be sure, depend, in part, upon his present at Christmas, but that money had long been allotted beforehand. He must have some new trousers and pay a debt of long standing to the shoemaker for putting new tops to his old boots, and he must order 3 shirts from the seamstress and a couple of pieces of linen. In short, all his money must be spent, and even if the director should be so kind as to order him to receive 45 rubles instead of 40 or even 50, it would be a mere nothing, a mere drop in the ocean towards the funds necessary for a cloak. Although he knew that Petrovich was often wrong-headed enough to blurt out some outrageous price, so that even his own wife could not refrain from exclaiming, "Have you lost your senses, you fool?" At one time he would not work at any price, and now it was quite likely that he had named a higher sum than the cloak would cost. But although he knew that Petrovich would undertake to make a cloak for 80 rubles, still, where was he to get the 80 rubles from? He might possibly manage half. Yes, half might be procured, but where was the other half to come from? But the reader must first be told where the first half came from. Akaki Akakievich had a habit of putting, for every ruble he spent, a groschen into a small box, fastened with a lock and key, and with a slit in the top for the reception of money. At the end of every half-year he counted over the heap of coppers and changed it for silver. This he had done for a long time, and in the course of years the sum had mounted up to over 40 rubles. Thus he had one half on hand, but where was he to find the other half? Where was he to get another 40 rubles from? Akaki Akakievich thought, and decided that it would be necessary to curtail his ordinary expenses, for the space of 1 year at least, to dispense with tea in the evening, to burn no candles, and, if there was anything which he must do, to go into his landlady's room and work by her light. When he went into the street, he must walk as lightly as he could and as cautiously, upon the stones, almost upon tiptoe, in order not to wear his heels down in too short a time. He must give the laundress as little to wash as possible, and, in order not to wear out his clothes, he must take them off as soon as he got home, and wear only his cotton dressing-gown, which had been long and carefully saved. To tell the truth, it was a little hard for him at first to accustom himself to these deprivations, but he got used to them at length, after a fashion, and all went smoothly. He even got used to being hungry in the evening, but he made up for it by treating himself, so to say, in spirit, by bearing ever in mind the idea of his future cloak. From that time forth, his existence seemed to become, in some way, fuller, as if he were married, or as if some other man lived in him, as if, in fact, he were not alone, and some pleasant friend had consented to travel along life's path with him, the friend being no other than the cloak, with thick wadding and a strong lining incapable of wearing out. He became more lively, and even his character grew firmer, like that of a man who has made up his mind and set himself a goal. From his face and gait, doubt and indecision, all hesitating and wavering traits disappeared of themselves. Fire gleamed in his eyes, and occasionally the boldest and most daring ideas flitted through his mind. Why not, for instance, have marten fur on the collar? The thought of this almost made him absent-minded. Once, in copying a letter, he nearly made a mistake, so that he exclaimed almost aloud, "Ugh!" and crossed himself. Once, in the course of every month, he had a conference with Petrovich on the subject of the cloak, where it would be better to buy the cloth and the colour and the price. He always returned home satisfied, though troubled, reflecting that the time would come at last when it could all be bought and then the cloak made. The affair progressed more briskly than he had expected. Far beyond all his hopes, the director awarded neither 40 nor 45 rubles for Akaky Akakievich's share, but 60. Whether he suspected that Akaky Akakievich needed a cloak, or whether it was merely chance, at all events, 20 extra rubles were by this means provided. This circumstance hastened matters. 2 or 3 months more of hunger, and Akaky Akakievich had accumulated about 80 rubles. His heart, generally so quiet, began to throb. On the first possible day, he went shopping in company with Petrovich. They bought some very good cloth, and at a reasonable rate too, for they had been considering the matter for 6 months, and rarely let a month pass without their visiting the shops to inquire prices. Petrovich himself said that no better cloth could be had. For lining, they selected a cotton stuff, but so firm and thick that Petrovich declared it to be better than silk, and even prettier and more glossy. They did not buy the marten fur, because it was, in fact, dear, but in its stead they picked out the very best of catskin which could be found in the shop, and which might, indeed, be taken for marten at a distance. Petrovich worked at the cloak 2 whole weeks, for there was a great deal of quilting, otherwise it would have been finished sooner. He charged 12 rubles for the job. It could not possibly have been done for less. It was all sewed with silk in small double seams, and Petrovich went over each seam afterwards with his own teeth, stamping in various patterns. It is difficult to say precisely on what day, but probably the most glorious one in Akaky Akakievich's life, when Petrovich at length brought home the cloak. He brought it in the morning, before the hour when it was necessary to start for the department. Never did a cloak arrive so exactly in the nick of time, for the severe cold had set in, and it seemed to threaten to increase. Petrovich brought the cloak himself, as befits a good tailor. On his countenance was a significant expression, such as Akaky Akakievich had never beheld there. He seemed fully sensible that he had done no small deed, and crossed a gulf separating tailors, who only put in linings and execute repairs, from those who make new things. He took the cloak out of the pocket handkerchief in which he had brought it. The handkerchief was fresh from the laundress, and he put it in his pocket for use. Taking out the cloak, he gazed proudly at it, held it up with both hands, and flung it skillfully over the shoulders of Akaky Akakievich. Then he pulled it and fitted it down behind with his hand, and he draped it around Akaky Akakievich without buttoning it. Akaky Akakievich, like an experienced man, wished to try the sleeves. Petrovich helped him on with them, and it turned out that the sleeves were satisfactory also. In short, the cloak appeared to be perfect and most seasonable. Petrovich did not neglect to observe that it was only because he lived in a narrow street and had no signboard, and had known Akaky Akakievich so long that he had made it so cheaply, but that if he had been in business on the Nevsky Prospect, he would have charged 75 rubles for the making alone. Akaky Akakievich did not care to argue this point with Petrovich. He paid him, thanked him, and set out at once in his new cloak for the department. Petrovich followed him, and pausing in the street, gazed long at the cloak in the distance, after which he went to one side expressly to run through a crooked alley, and emerge again into the street beyond, to gaze once more upon the cloak from another point, namely, directly in front. Meantime, Akaky Akakievich went on in holiday mood. He was conscious every second of the time that he had a new cloak on his shoulders, and several times he laughed with internal satisfaction. In fact, there were 2 advantages. One was its warmth, the other its beauty. He saw nothing of the road, but suddenly found himself at the department. He took off his cloak in the anteroom, looked it over carefully, and confided it to the especial care of the attendant. It is impossible to say precisely how it was that everyone in the department knew at once that Akaky Akakievich had a new cloak, and that the cape no longer existed. All rushed at the same moment into the anteroom to inspect it. They congratulated him and said pleasant things to him, so that he began at first to smile and then to grow ashamed. When all surrounded him and said that the new cloak must be christened, and that he must give a whole evening at least to this, Akaky Akakievich lost his head completely and did not know where he stood, what to answer, or how to get out of it. He stood blushing all over for several minutes, and was on the point of assuring them with great simplicity that it was not a new cloak, that it was so and so, that it was in fact the old cape. At length, one of the officials, a sub-chief probably, in order to show that he was not at all proud and on good terms with his inferiors, said, "So be it. Only I will give the party, instead of Akaky Akakievich. I invite you all to tea with me tonight. It happens quite apropos, as it is my name day." The officials naturally at once offered the sub-chief their congratulations and accepted the invitations with pleasure. Akaky Akakievich would have declined, but all declared that it was discourteous, that it was simply a sin and a shame, and that he could not possibly refuse. Besides, the notion became pleasant to him when he recollected that he should thereby have a chance of wearing his new cloak in the evening also. That whole day was truly a most triumphant festival day for Akaky Akakievich. He returned home in the most happy frame of mind, took off his cloak, and hung it carefully on the wall, admiring afresh the cloth and the lining. Then he brought out his old, worn-out cloak for comparison. He looked at it and laughed, so vast was the difference. And long after dinner he laughed again when the condition of the cape recurred to his mind. He dined cheerfully, and after dinner wrote nothing, but took his ease for a while on the bed until it got dark. Then he dressed himself leisurely, put on his cloak, and stepped out into the street. Where the host lived, unfortunately, we cannot say. Our memory begins to fail us badly, and the houses and streets in St. Petersburg have become so mixed up in our head that it is very difficult to get anything out of it again in proper form. This much is certain, that the official lived in the best part of the city, and therefore it must have been anything but near to Akaky Akakievich's residence. Akaky Akakievich was first obliged to traverse a kind of wilderness of deserted, dimly lighted streets, but in proportion as he approached the official's quarter of the city, the streets became more lively, more populous, and more brilliantly illuminated. Pedestrians began to appear, handsomely dressed ladies were more frequently encountered. The men had otter-skin collars to their coats. Peasant wagoners, with their grate-like sledges stuck over with brass-headed nails, became rarer, whilst on the other hand, more and more drivers in red velvet caps, lacquered sledges and bearskin coats began to appear, and carriages with rich hammercloths flew swiftly through the streets, their wheels scrunching the snow. Akaky Akakievich gazed upon all this as upon a novel sight. He had not been in the streets during the evening for years. He halted out of curiosity before a shop window to look at a picture representing a handsome woman who had thrown off her shoe, thereby baring her whole foot in a very pretty way, whilst behind her the head of a man with whiskers and a handsome moustache peeped through the doorway of another room. Akaky Akakievich shook his head and laughed, and then went on his way. Why did he laugh? Either because he had met with a thing utterly unknown, but for which everyone cherishes, nevertheless, some sort of feeling, or else he thought, like many officials, as follows: "Well, those French, what is to be said? If they do go in anything of that sort, why—" But possibly he did not think at all. Akaky Akakievich at length reached the house in which the sub-chief lodged. The sub-chief lived in fine style. The staircase was lit by a lamp, his apartment being on the second floor. On entering the vestibule, Akaky Akakievich beheld a whole row of galoshes on the floor. Among them, in the center of the room, stood a samovar or tea-urn, humming and emitting clouds of steam. On the walls hung all sorts of coats and cloaks, among which there were even some with beaver collars or velvet facings. Beyond, the buzz of conversation was audible and became clear and loud when the servant came out with a trayful of empty glasses, cream jugs, and sugar bowls. It was evident that the officials had arrived long before and had already finished their first glass of tea. Akaki Akakievich, having hung up his own cloak, entered the inner room. Before him all at once appeared lights, officials, pipes, and card tables, and he was bewildered by the sound of rapid conversation rising from all the tables and the noise of moving chairs. He halted very awkwardly in the middle of the room, wondering what he ought to do. But they had seen him. They received him with a shout, and all thronged at once into the anteroom, and there took another look at his cloak. Akaki Akakievich, although somewhat confused, was frank-hearted and could not refrain from rejoicing when he saw how they praised his cloak. Then, of course, they all dropped him and his cloak and returned, as was proper, to the tables set out for whist. All this, the noise, the talk, and the throng of people was rather overwhelming to Akaki Akakievich. He simply did not know where he stood or where to put his hands, his feet, and his whole body. Finally, he sat down by the players, looked at the cards, gazed at the face of one and another, and after a while began to gape and to feel that it was wearisome, the more so as the hour was already long past when he usually went to bed. He wanted to take leave of the host, but they would not let him go, saying that he must not fail to drink a glass of champagne in honor of his new garment. In the course of an hour, supper, consisting of vegetable salad, cold veal, pastry, confectioner's pies, and champagne, was served. They made Akaki Akakievich drink 2 glasses of champagne, after which he felt things grow livelier. Still, he could not forget that it was 12 o'clock, and that he should have been at home long ago. In order that the host might not think of some excuse for detaining him, he stole out of the room quickly, sought out, in the anteroom, his cloak, which, to his sorrow, he found lying on the floor, brushed it, picked off every speck upon it, put it on his shoulders, and descended the stairs to the street. In the street all was still bright. Some petty shops, those permanent clubs of servants, and all sorts of folk, were open. Others were shut, but nevertheless showed a streak of light the whole length of the door crack, indicating that they were not yet free of company, and that probably some domestics, male and female, were finishing their stories and conversations whilst leaving their masters in complete ignorance as to their whereabouts. Akaki Akakievich went on in a happy frame of mind. He even started to run, without knowing why, after some lady who flew past like a flash of lightning. But he stopped short and went on very quietly as before, wondering why he had quickened his pace. Soon there spread before him those deserted streets which are not cheerful in the daytime, to say nothing of the evening. Now they were even more dim and lonely. The lanterns began to grow rarer. Oil, evidently, had been less liberally supplied. Then came wooden houses and fences. Not a soul anywhere. Only the snow sparkled in the streets and mournfully veiled the low-roofed cabins with their closed shutters. He approached the spot where the street crossed a vast square with houses barely visible on its farther side, a square which seemed a fearful desert. Afar, a tiny spark glimmered from some watchman's box, which seemed to stand on the edge of the world. Akaki. Akakievich's cheerfulness diminished at this point in a marked degree. He entered the square, not without an involuntary sensation of fear, as though his heart warned him of some evil. He glanced back, and on both sides it was like a sea about him. No, it is better not to look, he thought, and went on, closing his eyes. When he opened them, to see whether he was near the end of the square, he suddenly beheld, standing just before his very nose, some bearded individuals of precisely what sort he could not make out. All grew dark before his eyes, and his heart throbbed. "But of course, the cloak is mine," said one of them in a loud voice, seizing hold of his collar. Akaki Akakievich was about to shout, "Watch!" when the second man thrust a fist about the size of a man's head into his mouth, muttering, "Now scream." Akaki Akakievich felt them strip off his cloak and give him a push with a knee. He fell headlong upon the snow and felt no more. In a few minutes he recovered consciousness and rose to his feet, but no one was there. He felt that it was cold in the square and that his cloak was gone. He began to shout, but his voice did not appear to reach to the outskirts of the square. In despair, but without ceasing to shout, he started at a run across the square, straight towards the watchbox, beside which stood the watchman, leaning on his halberd, and apparently curious to know what kind of a customer was running towards him and shouting. Akaki Akakievich ran up to him and began in a sobbing voice to shout that he was asleep and attended to nothing and did not see when a man was robbed. The watchman replied that he had seen two men stop him in the middle of the square, but supposed that they were friends of his, and that, instead of scolding vainly, he had better go to the police on the morrow so that they might make a search for whoever had stolen the cloak. Akakievich ran home in complete disorder. His hair, which grew very thinly upon his temples and the back of his head, wholly disordered. His body, arms and legs covered with snow. The old woman, who was mistress of his lodgings, on hearing a terrible knocking, sprang hastily from her bed, and, with only one shoe on, ran to open the door, pressing the sleeve of her chemise to her bosom out of modesty. But when she had opened it, she fell back on beholding Akaki Akakievich in such a state. When he told her about the affair, she clasped her hands and said that he must go straight to the district chief of police, for his subordinate would turn up his nose, promise well, and drop the matter there. The very best thing to do, therefore, would be to go to the district chief, whom she knew, because Finnish Anna, her former cook, was now nurse at his house. She often saw him passing the house, and he was at church every Sunday praying, but at the same time gazing cheerfully at everybody, so that he must be a good man, judging from all appearances. Having listened to this opinion, Akaki Akakievich betook himself sadly to his room, and how he spent the night there anyone who can put himself in another's place may readily imagine. Early in the morning he presented himself at the district chief's, but was told that this official was asleep. He went again at 10 and was again informed that he was asleep. At 11, and they said, "The superintendent is not at home," at dinner time, and the clerks in the anteroom would not admit him on any terms, and insisted upon knowing his business. So that at last, for once in his life, Akaki Akakievich felt an inclination to show some spirit, and said curtly that he must see the chief in person, that they ought not to presume to refuse him entrance, that he came from the Department of Justice, and that when he complained of them, they would see. The clerks dared make no reply to this, and one of them went to call the chief, who listened to the strange story of the theft of the coat. Instead of directing his attention to the principal points of the matter, he began to question Akaki Akakievich. Why was he going home so late? Was he in the habit of doing so, or had he been to some disorderly house? So that Akaki Akakievich got thoroughly confused, and left him without knowing whether the affair of his cloak was in proper train or not. All that day, for the first time in his life, he never went near the department. The next day he made his appearance, very pale, and in his old cape, which had become even more shabby. The news of the robbery of the cloak touched many, although there were some officials present who never lost an opportunity, even such a one as the present, of ridiculing Akaki Akakievich. They decided to make a collection for him on the spot, but the officials had already spent a great deal in subscribing for the director's portrait and for some book at the suggestion of the head of that division, who was a friend of the author. And so the sum was trifling. One of them, moved by pity, resolved to help Akaki Akakievich with some good advice at least, and told him that he ought not to go to the police. For although it might happen that a police officer, wishing to win the approval of his superiors, might hunt up the cloak by some means, still his cloak would remain in the possession of the police if he did not offer legal proof that it belonged to him. The best thing for him, therefore, would be to apply to a certain prominent personage, since this prominent personage, by entering into relations with the proper persons, could greatly expedite the matter. As there was nothing else to be done, Akaki Akakievich decided to go to the prominent personage. What was the exact official position of the prominent personage remains unknown to this day. The reader must know that the prominent personage had but recently become a prominent personage, having up to that time been only an insignificant person. Moreover, his present position was not considered prominent in comparison with others, still more so, but there is always a circle of people to whom what is insignificant in the eyes of others is important enough. Moreover, he strove to increase his importance by sundry devices. For instance, he managed to have the inferior officials meet him on the staircase when he entered upon his service. No one was to presume to come directly to him, but the strictest etiquette must be observed. The collegiate recorder must make a report to the government secretary to the titular councillor, or whatever other man was proper, and all business must come before him in this manner. In Holy Russia, all is thus contaminated with the love of imitation. Every man imitates and copies his superior. They even say that a certain titular councillor, when promoted to the head of some small separate room, immediately partitioned off a private room for himself, called it the audience chamber, and posted at the door a lackey with red collar and braid, who grasped the handle of the door and opened to all comers. Though the audience chamber could hardly hold an ordinary writing table, the manners and customs of the prominent personage were grand and imposing, but rather exaggerated. The main foundation of his system was strictness. Strictness, strictness, and always strictness, he generally said. And at the last word he looked significantly into the face of the person to whom he spoke. But there was no necessity for this, for the half-score of subordinates who formed the entire force of the office were properly afraid. On catching sight of him afar off, they left their work and waited, drawn up in line, until he had passed through the room. His ordinary converse with his inferiors smacked of sternness and consisted chiefly of three phrases. How dare you? Do you know whom you are speaking to? Do you realize who stands before you? Otherwise, he was a very kind-hearted man, good to his comrades, and ready to oblige, but the rank of general threw him completely off his balance. On receiving any one of that rank, he became confused, lost his way, as it were, and never knew what to do. If he chanced to be amongst his equals, he was still a very nice kind of man, a very good fellow in many respects, and not stupid. But the very moment that he found himself in the society of people but one rank lower than himself, he became silent, and his situation aroused sympathy, the more so as he felt himself that he might have been making an incomparably better use of his time. In his eyes there was sometimes visible a desire to join some interesting conversation or group, but he was kept back by the thought, would it not be a very great condescension on his part? Would it not be familiar? And would he not thereby lose his importance? And in consequence of such reflections, he always remained in the same dumb state, uttering from time to time a few monosyllabic sounds, and thereby earning the name of the most wearisome of men. To this prominent personage, Akaky Akakievitch presented himself, and this at the most unfavorable time for himself, though opportune for the prominent personage. The prominent personage was in his cabinet conversing gaily with an old acquaintance and companion of his childhood, whom he had not seen for several years, and who had just arrived when it was announced to him that a person named Bashmachkin had come. He asked abruptly, "Who is he?" "Some official," he was informed. "Ah, he can wait. This is no time for him to call," said the important man. It must be remarked here that the important man lied outrageously. He had said all he had to say to his friend long before, and the conversation had been interspersed for some time with very long pauses, during which they merely slapped each other on the leg and said, "You think so, Ivan Abramovich?" "Just so, Stepan Varlamich." Nevertheless, he ordered that the official should be kept waiting in order to show his friend, a man who had not been in the service for a long time, but had lived at home in the country, how long officials had to wait in his anteroom. At length, having talked himself completely out, and more than that, having had his fill of pauses and smoked a cigar in a very comfortable armchair with reclining back, he suddenly seemed to recollect and said to the secretary, who stood by the door with papers of reports, "So it seems that there is a chinovnik waiting to see me. Tell him that he may come in?" On perceiving Akaky Akakievitch's modest mien and his worn undress uniform, he turned abruptly to him and said, "What do you want?" in a curt, hard voice, which he had practiced in his room in private and before the looking-glass for a whole week before being raised to his present rank. Akaki Akakievich, who was already imbued with a due amount of fear, became somewhat confused, and as well as his tongue would permit, explained, with a rather more frequent addition than usual of the word that his cloak was quite new and had been stolen in the most inhuman manner, that he had applied to him in order that he might, in some way, by his intermediation, that he might enter into correspondence with the chief of police and find the cloak. For some inexplicable reason, this conduct seemed familiar to the prominent personage. "What, my dear sir," he said abruptly, "are you not acquainted with etiquette? Where have you come from? Don't you know how such matters are managed? You should first have entered a complaint about this at the court below. It would have gone to the head of the department, then to the chief of the division, then it would have been handed over to the secretary, and the secretary would have given it to me." "But, Your Excellency," said Akaki Akakievich, trying to collect his small handful of wits, and conscious at the same time that he was perspiring terribly, "I, Your Excellency, presume to trouble you because secretaries are an untrustworthy race." "What? What? What?" said the important personage. "Where did you get such courage? Where did you get such ideas? What impudence towards their chiefs and superiors has spread among the young generation?" The prominent personage apparently had not observed that Akaki Akakievich was already in the neighborhood of 50. If he could be called a young man, it must have been in comparison with someone who was 20. "Do you know to whom you speak? Do you realize who stands before you? Do you realize it? Do you realize it? I ask you." Then he stamped his foot and raised his voice to such a pitch that it would have frightened even a different man from Akaki Akakievich. Akaki Akakievich's senses failed him. He staggered, trembled in every limb, and, if the porters had not run to support him, would have fallen to the floor. They carried him out insensible. But the prominent personage, gratified that the effect should have surpassed his expectations, and quite intoxicated with the thought that his word could even deprive a man of his senses, glanced sideways at his friend in order to see how he looked upon this, and perceived, not without satisfaction, that his friend was in a most uneasy frame of mind, and even beginning, on his part, to feel a trifle frightened. Akaki Akakievich could not remember how he descended the stairs and got into the street. He felt neither his hands nor feet. Never in his life had he been so rated by any high official, let alone a strange one. He went staggering on through the snowstorm, which was blowing in the streets, with his mouth wide open. The wind, in St. Petersburg fashion, darted upon him from all quarters and down every cross-street. In a twinkling it had blown a quinsy into his throat, and he reached home unable to utter a word. His throat was swollen, and he lay down on his bed. So powerful is sometimes a good scolding. The next day a violent fever showed itself, thanks to the generous assistance of the saint. Petersburg climate, the malady progressed more rapidly than could have been expected, and when the doctor arrived, he found, on feeling the sick man's pulse, that there was nothing to be done except to prescribe a fomentation so that the patient might not be left entirely without the beneficent aid of medicine. But at the same time, he predicted his end in 36 hours. After this, he turned to the landlady and said, "And as for you, don't waste your time on him. Order his pine coffin now. For an oak, one will be too expensive for him." Did Akaki Akakievich hear these fatal words? And if he heard them, did they produce any overwhelming effect upon him? Did he lament the bitterness of his life? We know not, for he continued in a delirious condition. Visions incessantly appeared to him, each stranger than the other. Now he saw Petrovitch and ordered him to make a cloak with some traps for robbers, who seemed to him to be always under the bed, and cried every moment to the landlady to pull one of them from under his coverlet. Then he inquired why his old mantle hung before him when he had a new cloak. Next he fancied that he was standing before the prominent person, listening to a thorough setting down, and saying, "Forgive me, Your Excellency." But at last he began to curse, uttering the most horrible words, so that his aged landlady crossed herself, never in her life having heard anything of the kind from him, the more so as those words followed directly after the words, "Your Excellency." Later on he talked utter nonsense, of which nothing could be made, all that was evident being that his incoherent words and thoughts hovered ever about one thing, his cloak. At length, poor Akaky Akakievitch breathed his last. They sealed up neither his room nor his effects, because in the first place there were no heirs, and in the second there was very little to inherit beyond a bundle of goose quills, a quire of white official paper, 3 pairs of socks, 2 or 3 buttons which had burst off his trousers, and the mantle already known to the reader. To whom all this fell, God knows. I confess that the person who told me this tale took no interest in the matter. They carried Akaky Akakievitch out and buried him, and St. Petersburg was left without Akaky Akakievitch, as though he had never lived there. A being disappeared who was protected by none, dear to none, interesting to none, and who never even attracted to himself the attention of those students of human nature who omit no opportunity of thrusting a pin through a common fly and examining it under the microscope. A being who bore meekly the gibes of the department and went to his grave without having done one unusual deed, but to whom, nevertheless, at the close of his life appeared a bright visitant in the form of a cloak, which momentarily cheered his poor life, and upon whom, thereafter, an intolerable misfortune descended, just as it descends upon the mighty of this world. Several days after his death, the porter was sent from the department to his lodgings with an order for him to present himself there immediately, the chief commanding it. But the porter had to return unsuccessful with the answer that he could not come, and to the question, "Why?" replied, "Well, because he is dead. He was buried 4 days ago." In this manner did they hear of Akaky Akakievich's death at the department, and the next day a new official sat in his place, with a handwriting by no means so upright, but more inclined and slanting. But who could have imagined that this was not really the end of Akaky Akakievich, that he was destined to raise a commotion after death, as if in compensation for his utterly insignificant life? But so it happened, and our poor story unexpectedly gains a fantastic ending. A rumor suddenly spread through St. Petersburg that a dead man had taken to appearing on the Kalinkin Bridge and its vicinity at night in the form of a chinovnik seeking a stolen cloak, and that, under the pretext of its being the stolen cloak, he dragged, without regard to rank or calling, everyone's cloak from his shoulders, be it catskin, beaver, fox, bear, sable. In a word, every sort of fur and skin which men adopted for their covering. One of the department officials saw the dead man with his own eyes and immediately recognized in him Akaky Akakievich. This, however, inspired him with such terror that he ran off with all his might, and therefore did not scan the dead man closely, but only saw how the latter threatened him from afar with his finger. Constant complaints poured in from all quarters that the backs and shoulders, not only of titular, but even of court councillors, were exposed to the danger of a cold on account of the frequent dragging off of their cloaks. Arrangements were made by the police to catch the corpse, alive or dead, at any cost, and punish him as an example to others in the most severe manner. In this they nearly succeeded, for a watchman, on guard in Kirushkin Alley, caught the corpse by the collar on the very scene of his evil deeds when attempting to pull off the frieze coat of a retired musician. Having seized him by the collar, he summoned with a shout 2 of his comrades, whom he enjoined to hold him fast, while he himself felt for a moment in his boot, in order to draw out his snuff-box and refresh his frozen nose. But the snuff was of a sort which even a corpse could not endure. The watchman, having closed his right nostril with his finger, had no sooner succeeded in holding half a handful up to the left than the corpse sneezed so violently that he completely filled the eyes of all 3. While they raised their hands to wipe them, the dead man vanished completely, so that they positively did not know whether they had actually had him in their grip at all. Thereafter, the watchmen conceived such a terror of dead men that they were afraid even to seize the living, and only screamed from a distance, "Hey, there, go your way!" So the dead chinovnik began to appear even beyond the Kalinkin Bridge, causing no little terror to all timid people. But we have totally neglected that certain prominent personage who may really be considered as the cause of the fantastic turn taken by this true history. First of all, justice compels us to say that after the departure of poor, annihilated Akakievich, he felt something like remorse. Suffering was unpleasant to him, for his heart was accessible to many good impulses, in spite of the fact that his rank often prevented his showing his true self. As soon as his friend had left his cabinet, he began to think about poor Akaki Akakievich. And from that day forth, poor Akaki Akakievich, who could not bear up under an official reprimand, recurred to his mind almost every day. The thought troubled him to such an extent that a week later he even resolved to send an official to him to learn whether he really could assist him. And when it was reported to him that Akaki Akakievich had died suddenly of fever, he was startled, hearkened to the reproaches of his conscience, and was out of sorts for the whole day. Wishing to divert his mind in some way and drive away the disagreeable impression, he set out that evening for one of his friends' houses, where he found quite a large party assembled. What was better, nearly everyone was of the same rank as himself, so that he need not feel in the least constrained. This had a marvelous effect upon his mental state. He grew expansive, made himself agreeable in conversation. In short, he passed a delightful evening. After supper, he drank a couple of glasses of champagne. Not a bad recipe for cheerfulness, as everyone knows. The champagne inclined him to various adventures, and he determined not to return home, but to go and see a certain well-known lady of German extraction, Karolina Ivanovna, a lady, it appears, with whom he was on a very friendly footing. It must be mentioned that the prominent personage was no longer a young man, but a good husband and respected father of a family. 2 sons, one of whom was already in the service, and a good-looking 16-year-old daughter with a rather retrousse but pretty little nose, came every morning to kiss his hand and say, "Bonjour, papa." His wife, a still fresh and good-looking woman, first gave him her hand to kiss, and then, reversing the procedure, kissed his. But the prominent personage, though perfectly satisfied in his domestic relations, considered it stylish to have a friend in another quarter of the city. This friend was scarcely prettier or younger than his wife, but there are such puzzles in the world, and it is not our place to judge them. So the important personage descended the stairs, stepped into his sledge, said to the coachman, "To Karolina Ivanovna's," and wrapping himself luxuriously in his warm cloak, found himself in that delightful frame of mind than which a Russian can conceive no better, namely, when you think of nothing yourself, yet when the thoughts creep into your mind of their own accord, each more agreeable than the other, giving you no trouble either to drive them away or seek them. Fully satisfied, he recalled all the gay features of the evening just past, and all the mots which had made the little circle laugh. Many of them he repeated in a low voice, and found them quite as funny as before, so it is not surprising that he should laugh heartily at them. Occasionally, however, he was interrupted by gusts of wind, which, coming suddenly, God knows whence or why, cut his face, drove masses of snow into it, filled out his cloak collar like a sail, or suddenly blew it over his head with supernatural force, and thus caused him constant trouble to disentangle himself. Suddenly, the important personage felt someone clutch him firmly by the collar. Turning round, he perceived a man of short stature, in an old, worn uniform, and recognized, not without terror, Akaki Akakievich. The official's face was white as snow, and looked just like a corpse's, but the horror of the important personage transcended all bounds when he saw the dead man's mouth open and, with a terrible odor of the grave, gave vent to the following remarks. "Ah, here you are at last. I have you that, by the collar. I need your cloak. You took no trouble about mine, but reprimanded me. So now, give up your own." The pallid, prominent personage almost died of fright. Brave as he was in the office, and in the presence of inferiors generally, and although, at the sight of his manly form and appearance, everyone said, "Ugh, how much character he had!" At this crisis, he, like many possessed of an heroic exterior, experienced such terror that not without cause he began to fear an attack of illness. He flung his cloak hastily from his shoulders and shouted to his coachman in an unnatural voice, "Home at full speed." The coachman, hearing the tone which is generally employed at critical moments and even accompanied by something much more tangible, drew his head down between his shoulders in case of an emergency, flourished his whip, and flew on like an arrow. In a little more than 6 minutes, the prominent personage was at the entrance of his own house. Pale, thoroughly scared, and cloakless, he went home instead of to Karolina Ivanovna's, reached his room somehow or other, and passed the night in the direst distress, so that the next morning over their tea his daughter said, "You are very pale today, Papa." But Papa remained silent, and said not a word to any one of what had happened to him, where he had been, or where he had intended to go. This occurrence made a deep impression upon him. He even began to say, "How dare you? Do you realize who stands before you?" Less frequently to the under-officials, and if he did utter the words, it was only after having first learned the bearings of the matter. But the most noteworthy point was that from that day forward, the apparition of the dead chinovnik ceased to be seen. Evidently, the prominent personage's cloak just fitted his shoulders. At all events, no more instances of his dragging cloaks from people's shoulders were heard of. But many active and apprehensive persons could by no means reassure themselves, and asserted that the dead chinovnik still showed himself in distant parts of the city. In fact, one watchman in Kolomna saw with his own eyes the apparition come from behind a house. But being rather weak of body, he dared not arrest him, but followed him in the dark until at length the apparition looked round, paused, and inquired, "What do you want?" at the same time showing a fist such as is never seen on living men. The watchman said, "It's of no consequence," and turned back instantly. But the apparition was much too tall, wore huge moustaches, and directing its steps apparently towards the Obukhov bridge, disappeared in the darkness of the night.